What if all the continents we know today were once one? A single vast land stretching endlessly, where deserts, forests, and oceans met as neighbors rather than strangers. Imagine walking across a world without borders, where the pulse of life moved in a rhythm older than memory itself. This is Pangea, the supercontinent that shaped the earth long before humans, long before cities, long before even the oceans divided. In this journey, we will drift through time, following the rise and fall of mountains, the march of creatures great and small, and the quiet, patient shaping of a world both familiar and lost. Close your eyes and let us walk together across a land forgotten by time, where every stone, every river, every whisper of wind holds the story of life itself.
What if there were no borders between us at all? No oceans to cross, no seas to divide, only one vast body of land stretching like a single breath across the face of the earth. What if we could walk endlessly from what we now call Africa to the lands of the Americas without ever seeing the horizon of an ocean? The idea feels strange, almost impossible, because we are used to a world cut into pieces. But once, long ago, the Earth's skin was whole, and all its living forms shared one common stage. They call this place Pangea, a word that means all earth. And it was as if the planet itself had chosen to draw everything inward, to pull the scattered fragments together into a single embrace. Mountains leaned against mountains, valleys folded into one another, deserts stretched wider than our modern imagination, and rivers carried their silts not to separate seas, but to one great ocean surrounding all. If we close our eyes, we can imagine this silence, the sense of being at the center of everything, knowing that there was no edge of land beyond which another continent waited. There was only one continent, one story, one vastness. To live in such a world would have been to know distance differently. The walk across Pangea could take years, even lifetimes, and yet it would always be land beneath your feet, the same soil shifting in texture, but never in essence. The winds that moved across this supercontinent would gather no salt spray from narrow seas, only dust from the endless interior deserts, dust that carried the memory of stone and the slow erosion of mountains far away. The air itself might have felt heavier, laden with the breath of forests so wide they seemed infinite, and yet broken by sudden plains of silence, where only the wind spoke. Scientists tell us that Pangea was not just a dream, but a reality woven by plate tectonics, the patient drift of Earth's outer shell riding on the restless mantle below. Continents are not still, they are rafts, vast slabs of lithosphere floating on molten motion. Over millions of years, collisions stitched them together, sutures forming mountain belts where seas once lay. The Appalachians, the Urals, even the mountains of Morocco are scars of this ancient uniting. If we run our fingers across a modern map, tracing the shapes of South America and Africa, we see the echo of this unity in their matching curves, puzzle pieces torn apart by time. And yet there is a mystery in thinking about Pangea, not only as geology, but as memory. Could the Earth itself remember this wholeness in the way fossils remember bodies or sediments remember rivers? The rocks still carry isotopes that reveal climates, oxygen ratios that whisper of ancient atmospheres, layers of coal that speak of dense forests where now deserts lie. The Earth does not forget easily. It records everything in minerals, in dust, in silence. And so we find ourselves wondering, is memory more than a human act? Could it be that stone itself is a kind of archive, and that Pangea survives not as an idea, but as a body pressed into the very structure of the land beneath us? To imagine walking across this continent is also to imagine a different kind of life. Creatures that roamed Pangea had the freedom of vast, unbroken landscapes. Early reptiles wandered from one horizon to another without meeting oceans, carrying their lineages across thousands of miles. Forests stretched until they reached deserts, and deserts ended only when mountains rose. The migrations of life were not constrained by seas, but by climate, by hunger, by the turning of seasons. And in this mobility, evolution found new shapes, new patterns, spreading species across the globe with little resistance. The fossils we find today, scattered across continents, are like signatures left in different chapters of the same book. There is something humbling in this. We live now in a fractured world, continents isolated, oceans wide, human borders layered upon natural ones. But once, long before we named them, all lands were one. It reminds us of a truth both scientific and philosophical, that division is temporary, that separation is an illusion of time. The entropy of tectonic drift scattered Pangea, just as entropy scatters all ordered things, yet the memory of wholeness lingers. Perhaps this is why we look at maps and feel a strange sense of fit between their edges, a half-conscious recognition that these pieces belong together, like fragments of a vessel we know once held water. If we stood at the center of Pangea, what would we have seen? Perhaps the sky would have seemed larger, with no horizon broken by seas. Perhaps the stars at night would have felt closer, reflected only in lakes and rivers, but never in the open sea. And perhaps the silence itself would have been overwhelming, not empty, but full of the sound of insects, the shifting sands, the creaking forests, the low calls of animals, all carried across a continent that had no end. To imagine it is to feel a different scale of belonging, as though the earth itself were a single room, vast and unbroken. And yet, if a whole world can come together and then scatter, if mountains can rise from oceans and deserts can swallow forests, then what else might be gathered and lost? If continents themselves are only temporary shapes, what does that say of us, of our civilizations, of our memories? Could it be that we too are fragments of a larger whole, drifting, breaking, and perhaps one day rejoining? And so we leave this first vision of unity with a question that lingers like dust on the wind. If Pangea was once real, and its traces still live in the stones beneath our feet, what other pieces of Earth's puzzle remain hidden, waiting for us to see their fit in the grander design?
If continents themselves are only temporary shapes, what does that say of the fragments we live upon today? The truth is written not only in imagination, but in stone. And it is through stone that the first whispers of Pangea revealed themselves. not to poets or dreamers, but to those who studied the broken surface of the earth and noticed how its edges seemed to long for one another. When we look at a map now, our eyes cannot help but trace the outline of South America bending gently toward Africa, like two pieces that once fitted neatly together. The curve of Brazil and the Gulf of Guinea are not chance. They are echoes of an ancient union, a memory of closeness before drift pulled them apart. It was this simple, quiet observation that planted the earliest seed of the Pangea theory, though at first it was only suspicion, a thought not yet fully embraced. Could the earth itself have once been whole? And are these scattered lands simply shards of a greater body? Geology has a way of turning suspicion into memory. Rocks across oceans were compared and found to match in age and structure. Mountains, once torn apart, still hold the same pulse in their cores, as though they were siblings separated by time. The Appalachian Mountains of North America and the Caledonian Ranges of Scotland and Norway are made of the same folded stone, broken not by chance, but by the slow stretching of Earth's skin. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the strain, the groaning silence of rocks pulled away from one another, carrying the memory of collision in their tilted layers. Fossils, too, tell this story. The same ancient species of plants and animals appear on continents now divided by vast oceans. Glossopteris, a fern-like tree, once spread its leaves across what is now South America, Africa, India, and Antarctica. Its fossilized remains rest in soils that today lie worlds apart. And yet, in their quiet persistence, they remind us that oceans are only recent scars, that land was once a single breathing surface. Could life itself have sensed that unity, spreading freely, unaware that one day salt water would carve impassable boundaries? Scientists look deeper still, beyond shape and fossil, into the isotopes of stone. In the chemistry of minerals lies the fingerprint of ancient climates. Ratios of oxygen trapped in quartz, carbon preserved in coal seams, strontium in marine shells. Each carries a signal of temperature, rainfall, and sunlight. When the same isotopic stories appear in rocks half a world apart, we realize they were once neighbors, basking under the same skies, drinking from the same rivers of air. The stones themselves do not lie. They remember with a patience far beyond ours. And yet, even with evidence spread before us, the idea of drifting continents was once met with resistance. For centuries, people believed the continents were fixed, anchored like islands in a vast immovable sea. To suggest they could wander, that land could float like rafts across molten depths, seemed absurd. But sometimes truth begins as a quiet absurdity, only later unfolding into acceptance. Alfred Wegener, the scientist who first gave voice to this drifting vision, was ridiculed in his time, and yet he could not ignore the puzzle of broken stones, nor the way fossils whispered of a world once whole. He died before his theory was widely believed, leaving us with a thought that was too strange for its own age, but too persistent to vanish. Now we know that the Earth's crust is restless, driven by convection in the mantle, the slow churning of heat left over from the planet's birth. Plates collide, split, subduct beneath one another, and through their motion Pangea was both made and undone.
But we must remind ourselves, this is not just mechanics. It is a story of memory and loss, of wholeness and fracture, of silence turned into stone. Each coastline we see today is not an edge, but a wound, the result of separation, the mark of entropy working patiently upon the face of Earth. Perhaps that is why the shapes of continents move us more than we admit. When we see how neatly they might fit, we feel something beyond science, a sense of nostalgia for a world we never knew, a longing for unity written into geography itself. Maybe the Earth is not the only one that remembers. Maybe we too, in some quiet corner of mind, recognize the pattern of belonging, the truth that things once joined can be broken, and that broken things still carry the memory of their former wholeness. The puzzle of broken stones, then, is not merely about geology, it is about perception. It asks us to look beyond the map as it is, and imagine the map as it was, to see not separation, but connection, not isolation, but unity. The pieces are scattered, but they still speak to each other across oceans, across silence, across time.
If the land holds memory in its folds, if stones themselves remember the touch of oceans and forests, then perhaps we too must step back and ask how long such memory truly lasts. Because what we are speaking of now is not the memory of centuries or even millennia, but of deep time, the incomprehensible scales upon which continents move, oceans vanish, and life reshapes itself again and again. To enter deep time is to surrender the rhythm of human clocks, to loosen our grip on minutes and years, and to drift instead into the slow breathing of the earth. Pangea was only one breath in this vast rhythm. Before it, there were other supercontinents, Rodinia, Gondwana, Columbia, each one assembling from scattered pieces only to fracture again under the relentless drift of tectonic plates. The Earth does not stay still. It exhales and inhales land masses across hundreds of millions of years, folding oceans closed and opening new ones in their place. Imagine a world where the Atlantic does not exist, where instead of familiar maps there are shapes unrecognizable, yet still part of the same planet we call home. To think of this is to realize that permanence is an illusion, that even the ground beneath us is always in motion, even when we cannot feel it. Deep time speaks in scales that humble us. The entire span of human civilization, from the first stone tools to the satellites circling above us now, is less than the blink of an eye compared to the ages in which Pangea formed and dissolved. It took tens of millions of years for that land to draw together, and tens of millions more for it to drift apart. What we see as a static map is only a still frame of an endless film, a single breath caught in stone. Could it be that our own sense of stability is simply a trick of short memory, that if we could stretch our perception wider, we would see the continents themselves as restless as waves? Geologists use the language of isotopes and radiometric clocks to glimpse this vastness. uranium decaying into lead, potassium into argon, carbon into nitrogen, each transformation a patient metronome that ticks not in seconds, but in millions of years. By reading these isotopic signatures in rocks, we can reconstruct ages older than imagination, times when Pangea was not yet born or already gone. It is as though the Earth hides a series of clocks inside its minerals, clocks that do not measure our lives, but the lives of continents themselves. And still, deep time is not only about the stones, it is about the cycles of life that unfolded across those vast expanses. When Pangea rose, climates shifted, monsoons circled its edges, deserts spread in its center, and species adapted in ways that would shape all that followed. Extinctions wiped away most forms of life, yet each time the earth breathed in again, filling its lungs with new forests, new creatures, new possibilities. Entropy eroded, but renewal followed. Could it be that deep time is not a march toward an ending, but a rhythm of endings and beginnings, a tide more immense than any ocean? Perhaps this is why thinking of deep time is both comforting and unsettling. On one hand, it reminds us that nothing lasts, not even mountains, not even seas. On the other, it tells us that nothing is truly lost, that the dust of what came before lingers, reshaped into something new. The forests of Pangea may be gone, but their coal seams remain, pressed into black stone beneath our feet. The oceans swallowed in collisions may no longer exist, but their sediments rest quietly inside mountain ridges. Even extinction does not erase but transform, folding memory into the next chapter of Earth's becoming. And yet, how do we hold such scales in our minds? Our lives are brief, measured in decades, perhaps a century if we are fortunate. Against the backdrop of millions of years, we are like sparks in a dark night, flickering for an instant and then gone. But what if we do not need to hold it all? What if the value of deep time is not in grasping its entirety, but in recognizing the humility it brings? To know that we walk across stones older than memory, that each grain of sand once belonged to mountains no longer here, is to realize that we too are part of this breathing earth, carried along in its slow inhale and exhale. Deep time is not an empty abstraction. It is a presence. It is in the cliffs we walk beside, the fossils pressed into shale, the coal that warms our homes, the oil that fuels our machines. These are not just resources, but remnants, fragments of other ages whispering to us in silence. To touch them is to touch time itself, to place our hands on the skin of a planet that has lived through worlds we will never see. And so the breath of deep time lingers, flowing through the rise and fall of continents, through extinction and renewal, through silence and memory. If Pangea was only one inhalation, then we live in the pause between breaths, waiting for the earth to draw itself together again. And yet, if time can stretch this far, if continents themselves can come and go, what else lies hidden in these rhythms? What mysteries sleep in the ocean swallowed, in the mountains raised, in the silence of ages we have not yet uncovered?
The gentle hush of deep time lingers still,
and as it moves, it carries us toward the waters that once wrapped the world in shifting arms, oceans whose names are now half-lost whispers in the corridors of geology. Before Pangea rose as a single body of land, the earth was a scattered collection of drifting fragments, and between them stretched seas so vast and old that their horizons could not be imagined. Oceans like the Iapetus, the Rheic, the Euralian, names that sound like half-remembered songs, relics of worlds that folded inward and vanished as the continents pressed together. These waters were not erased in an instant, but in a slow retreat, an endless narrowing of their blue, where coastlines crept toward one another like patient hands about to meet. Imagine an ocean shrinking not across years or centuries, but across tens of millions of years, its surface still shimmering with waves, yet its basin being slowly crushed between advancing lands. Every ripple on those seas carried the promise of disappearance, and every tide was part of a farewell that would take an age to complete. These oceans, though gone, left their stories in layers of stone. When we look into mountain ranges today, the Appalachians in North America, the Urals in Russia, the highlands of northern Europe, we are not just looking at raised ridges of earth. We are looking at the graves of ancient seas. Their waters once stretched wide, home to creatures long forgotten. Yet as plates collided and continents drew near, those seabeds were lifted upward, squeezed into ridges and folds that rose toward the sky. The seabed became summits, the silt became stone, and the shells of marine life became fossils pressed into mountain walls. What we now call land was once ocean floor. What we now call permanence was once fluid, salt-stirred, and restless. The Iapetus Ocean, for example, once lay between what would become North America and Europe, a watery expanse alive with trilobites, brachiopods, and early fish. For hundreds of millions of years it spread in quiet dominion, but slowly, invisibly, it began to close. Island arcs, volcanic ridges, and fragments of crust crashed into one another, narrowing the waters until the last of Iapetus was squeezed shut. Its closure did not leave a void, but a monument, the Appalachians, and mountain range older than the Atlantic itself, holding within its folded rocks the memory of the ocean it buried. To touch those stones is to touch a seabed lifted into sky, to run your hand over the very wrinkles of a drowned world. The Rheic Ocean tells a similar tale, its waters once flowing between southern continents before they drifted together into Gondwana. This ocean vanished too, leaving its mark in belts of deformed rock across Europe and South America. Like pages folded inward, its story was pressed tight into the crust, layered upon itself until only fragments remained. Oceans do not die in silence. They echo in the landscapes that replace them, their waves immortalized in patterns of stone, their currents fossilized in the swirl of metamorphic veins. And then there was the Paleotethys, an ancient sea that stretched like a mirror of light across the equator, later replaced by the even greater Tethys Ocean.
This shifting, vanishing body of water folded and refolded across eras, its fragments trapped in the modern Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Caspian. To walk along the cliffs of Greece or the coasts of Turkey is to walk upon sediments born in seas long vanished, to look out at waters that are but small echoes of a once immense and world-shaping expanse. The folding of these oceans was not just a geological event, but a transformation of life itself. As seas narrowed, coastlines merged, and ecosystems collided, creatures that had once lived in isolation found themselves neighbors or rivals. Species vanished, others adapted, and in this quiet collision of continents, the story of evolution was redirected. Land bridges emerged where seas had been, pathways across which plants, animals, and eventually the ancestors of reptiles and mammals spread. Entire evolutionary branches may owe their existence to the vanishing of these oceans, to the squeezing out of habitats that forced life into new shapes. To think of an ocean folding is to stretch the mind into scales of time it struggles to hold. A sea that seems infinite today may, across hundreds of millions of years, shrink into nothing, leaving only salt crystals in stone and ripple marks frozen in cliffs. Imagine standing at the shore of a vast blue horizon, unaware that one day this very place would be uplifted into peaks and valleys, that the waves breaking at your feet would one day be read in the tilt of a mountain's strata. Pangea was built on the bones of oceans. Its mountains were tombs of vanished waters, its valleys the seams of ancient seas. Every stone held a memory of tide, every ridge a memory of depth. And though the waters themselves retreated, their breath never fully left. The rain, the rivers, the lakes, all are fragments of oceans reborn on the surface of land, reminders that nothing truly disappears, it only shifts, folds, and finds a new form. And so the question lingers like a tide at dusk. If oceans themselves can fold inward and vanish, their vastness compressed into stone, what then does it mean for permanence? Is there anything on this earth, however wide, however deep, that does not carry within it the seeds of disappearance?
From the memory of vanished oceans came something unexpected, something immense. For when seas closed, when their waves no longer had space to roam, the land did not remain flat and quiet. It heaved upward, as though the weight of the water had pressed down for eons, and with its retreat the crust was released, folding, breaking, rising. These folds became mountains. Mountains that were not born in fire like volcanoes, but in silence, in pressure, in the slow meeting of one plate with another. Oceans had been cradles of life for millions of years, but now their absence gave birth to new landscapes. Landscapes that would one day shape climates, rivers, and the very pathways of animals and people long after Pangea. The rocks that once rested deep below the sea floor were lifted toward the sunlight. Imagine seabeds layered with shells, with corals, with the fine dust of ancient plankton, all compacted into limestone, then tilted and raised, becoming ridges that clawed toward the sky. What had been an ocean floor now stood as cliffs. What had been sand washed by tides hardened into sandstone and was now carved by wind. In these mountains one could read the memory of oceans, each ridge, each vein of fossilized coral, a whisper of waves long gone. The Himalayas, much later in Earth's story, would rise in this same way, remnants of seas folded into summits. But during Pangea, these newborn mountains, stitched across the supercontinent like seams, marking where seas had closed. Geologists call them sutures, but they are more than lines of collision. They are scars of vanished waters, reminders of the restless balance between earth and sea. And with mountains came rivers. Rain, carried across vast interiors of Pangea, fell upon these uplifted ridges, cutting valleys through stone, carrying minerals back down to the plains. The cycle began again. What once was sea became stone. What once was stone dissolved into rivers, and what rivers carried would one day find its way back to ocean. In this way, nothing was truly lost, only transformed. Stand for a moment within this imagination. Picture yourself walking along a ridge of sharp limestone, seashells pressed into the walls around you, though the nearest ocean is 1,000 miles away. The wind whistles across these stones, cold, thin, carrying the smell not of salt water, but of dust. And as you run your hand across the rock, you feel grooves, curves, spirals of creatures that once drifted beneath waves. The mountains are not only made of water, they remember it. Yet these mountains also altered the world around them. They changed weather. They redirected winds. They cast shadows that dried certain lands into deserts and gathered rains upon others. The very climate of Pangea, harsh and uneven, was in part sculpted by the ranges that rose where seas had folded shut. And creatures, those who had walked, swum, or crawled, now found new worlds to adapt to. Insects that once skimmed wetlands had to climb. Early reptiles crept into highlands where rivers trickled down. Forests of conifers rooted themselves on slopes, their seeds carried by winds over bare stone. The disappearance of an ocean did not mean the end of life, but its redirection, its expansion into forms that could endure new heights. All of this silent work of stone, unfolded over spans of time so vast that the rise of a mountain could never be seen by a single set of eyes. Generations passed, species appeared and vanished, and yet the slow upward heaving continued, patient, unstoppable. This is the rhythm of Earth, never hurried, yet never still. From the folding of oceans came peaks that touched the clouds. From the quiet crushing of rock came landscapes of awe. And though time would one day wear them down again, returning their stones to sand and clay, for this chapter of Earth they stood as monuments of transformation. Mountains, born of water, standing as the eternal memory of seas that no longer were. And so Pangea grew not only as a landmass, but as a land of contrasts, low basins and high ridges, dry interiors and rain-fed slopes. The story of its heart was written in stone, carried from ocean floors to mountain summits. But mountains, too, are never the final word. They rise and they fall, and in their shadows new life always finds its chance to begin.
From the summits that had risen where seas once lay, the land began to spread outward in silence, its high ridges spilling into wide plateaus, its folded ranges giving way to stretches of open earth that seemed to have no end. Here, in the very core of Pangea, there were no oceans to soften the climate, no constant breezes from distant waters to carry rain across the plains. Instead, there was stillness, an arid hush, a vastness so immense that clouds themselves often dissolved before crossing its breadth. The supercontinent was so large, so joined in one body, that moisture from the surrounding seas could not easily reach the inner lands. Storms that gathered at the coasts broke their tempests long before the middle could feel them. Winds ran out of strength, rain fell in diminishing sheets, until at last only hot and hollow skies remained over the heart. It was here that deserts, wider than any known today, began to take shape. These were not the shifting dunes of a single horizon. They were worlds within themselves, arid basins that stretched for thousands of kilometers, rocky wastes where the sun lingered for unbroken seasons, and dry salt flats left behind by vanished lakes. Each grain of sand in these deserts carried the memory of ancient waters that had retreated forever. Imagine walking across them in that time. The ground would not be a uniform sea of yellow dunes, but a mosaic of harsh terrains, red sandscapes glowing under the sun, stony expanses cracked and jagged, and shallow hollows where wind had carved out patterns that looked almost like forgotten scripts written on the earth. There would be little sound, save for the shifting whisper of sand carried in gusts that died as quickly as they rose. These deserts were born not only from the absence of rain, but from the continent's sheer immensity. When land is too wide, when seas are too far, the balance of life tilts. Rivers dry before they can reach the deep, lakes vanish into air, and what remains is the stark presence of silence. In Pangea's heart, silence was the ruler, and it shaped landscapes of stone and dust. And yet, even in these arid expanses, life found ways to endure. Ancient conifers stretched their roots deep to chase the faint traces of water hidden below. Primitive reptiles, the distant kin of creatures that would later dominate the earth, moved slowly across the sands, conserving strength beneath the harsh sun. Insects darted from shadow to shadow, and beneath the sand itself, burrowing species found refuge in the cool below. The deserts seemed empty, but in truth they held a hidden resilience. The air above them carried heat by day, but at night, as the sun sunk, the temperatures plummeted, and the land released its stored warmth into the dark. Beneath the stars, the deserts of Pangea would have glittered faintly with crystals of salt and pale sand reflecting the moonlight, a silent testimony that even desolation had its beauty. To the creatures that crossed them, these regions were both barrier and home. Herds of early reptiles may have skirted the edges, traveling along rivers that still trickled in from the highlands, but those adapted to the harshness thrived where others could not. The deserts carved the path of evolution just as surely as the seas and the mountains did, selecting for resilience, for cunning, for those who could survive where the world seemed intent on silence. And always the wind moved across the dunes. Slowly, patiently, it shifted the sand into ridges, erased old shapes, and wrote new ones. The desert was never fixed. It was a living motion, too slow to see in the moment, but unstoppable across the ages. Entire valleys could fill with drifting grains, rivers could vanish under layers of sand, and mountains themselves could be worn smooth by the endless abrasion of dust carried in the air. The deserts of Pangea were not simply empty places, they were forces of change, sculptors of the land, reminders that absence could shape just as powerfully as presence. Where the oceans had once whispered and the mountains had risen, now silence and dryness held dominion, pressing down on the heart of the supercontinent. From above, if one could have floated through those ancient skies, the view would have been staggering. Coasts rich with forests and wetlands, mountain chains rising like scars across the land, and then in the middle, an expanse so vast and pale that it seemed to swallow the horizon, a sea of dryness spreading outward in every direction, where the echoes of vanished waters lingered in the shifting sands. And so the deserts lay at the heart of Pangea, vast and unbroken, shaping the world in ways both visible and unseen. For it is often in the emptiness, in the silence of desolation, that the deepest transformations are born. From the parched silence of Pangea's inner deserts, where sand drifted endlessly beneath a sun that spared no mercy, the land slowly shifted, as though the world itself were drawing breath in a different rhythm. Step by step, the barren heat gave way, and the air began to change. Clouds gathered more often near the coasts, rising from warm seas that lapped against Pangea's long and jagged shorelines. And here, where the ocean's breath could still reach the land, forests grew like emerald guardians at the very edges of the supercontinent. These were not the forests we know today, yet they whispered in familiar ways. Their leaves caught the rain and scattered it into trickles that fed the earth below. Their roots locked into the soil, weaving strength into the ground. Their shadows cast a coolness that was precious, for beyond them lay hundreds of miles of wasteland and burning stone. To live at the edge of Pangea was to live in the shelter of green. Towering trees rose skyward, some kin to the conifers we still recognize, others belonging to stranger, more ancient families. There were towering lycophytes,
survivors from older worlds, and cycads with fronds that unfolded like great fans. Whole forests of ferns thrived in the damp air, their leaves stretching into a canopy that caught the glow of the filtered sun. These forests were places of refuge where life could gather, endure, and expand. Among the trunks, creatures moved quietly. Amphibians clung to shadowed pools, their lives bound to water, yet eager to breathe the air. Reptiles, small but persistent, scuttled along branches, their scales catching flashes of light. Insects hummed through the greenery, dragonflies with wings wider than a hand, beetles armored in shining plates. In the warmth of these coastal belts, life was not only surviving, it was practicing, experimenting, preparing for futures yet to unfold. And always the sea was near. The forests leaned toward it, their roots drinking from rivers that ran down to the shore. The tides carried whispers inland, rich with salt and mystery. Fish, crustaceans, and early marine reptiles swam in the shallows, while birds, those masters of the sky, were not yet born. Instead, the air belonged to insects, filling the stillness with their flickering flight. It is strange to imagine Pangea's forests as both fragile and vast. Fragile because without the rains they would wither, their leaves shriveling beneath the same relentless sun that ruled the deserts. Vast because they stretched like an endless band, ringing the outer rim of the supercontinent. From afar, if one could have flown high enough, the edges of Pangea might have looked like a dark green crown against the pale interior, life clinging where land and sea embraced. These forests were laboratories of change. They held the balance between dry land and open water. They were the places where plants tested new shapes, where roots drove deeper, where seeds hardened into shells to travel further. They were thresholds where reptiles began to imagine new dominions, where the memory of the ocean and the promise of the future intertwined. And they were reminders of contrast. To walk outward from the desert toward the coast was to step through epochs of climate in a single journey. From blistering silence, one might cross stony plains, then scrublands, and finally, at last, the cool, damp shadows of towering green. Every leaf, every drop of dew was a kind of miracle, an oasis stretched into a world. Perhaps most haunting is the thought of sound. The desert heart of Pangea would have been nearly silent, a place where only the wind carried its low voice. But at the edges, the forests sang. The calls of early reptiles echoed beneath the canopy. Insects droned in swarms, water burbled over stones, and the leaves themselves whispered with every breeze. Life here had found its chorus, a rhythm that promised continuity. And yet, even as they flourished, the forests lived on borrowed time. The climate of Pangea was not stable. Storms came and went with cycles that spanned ages. Heat would rise, rains would falter, seas would retreat. But in their moment, the coastal forests were sanctuaries, places where the world remembered that it could still nurture. They were the green breath at the edge of a continent that at its center still gasped beneath the weight of dust and fire.
So when we imagine Pangea, we must see both faces, the barren heart and the living rim. One could not exist without the other. The desert showed the cost of immensity. The forests revealed the gift of balance. And somewhere within those shadows, hidden in the ferns and roots, life was writing the next chapter of its story. For soon the world would change again. Seas would rise, climates would tilt, and the forests at the edges of the world would either adapt or vanish into the silence of memory.
Along the fringes of Pangea, where the forests spread like dark emerald cloaks against the lapping edge of the sea, life took on new shapes. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and resin, the canopy alive with whispers of creatures that had learned to climb, to leap, to glide between trunks older than mountains themselves. Here, on the rim of a continent so vast it seemed to have no end, animals found shelter, food, and paths into futures yet unwritten. The green belts were more than oases of life. They were laboratories of change. While the deserts of the interior burned with heat and silence, these forested margins trembled with the rustling of bodies, each movement a reminder that survival was not just about endurance, but about invention. Ferns reached upward, cycads unfurled, and among them vertebrates began to test the world in ways that had never been attempted before. In the thick shadows beneath towering conifers, amphibians crept across damp ground, their skin glistening with the weight of a world that still tied them to water. They were creatures half of one realm and half of another, echoes of an ancient age when all land animals had emerged from shallow lagoons. But alongside them, new voices entered the forest. The reptiles, scaled, dry-skinned, built to hold the desert sun within their bodies, spread into the trees and filled niches where amphibians could not go. These reptiles were not yet the dinosaurs that would one day thunder across the earth, but their forms hinted at what was coming. Some remained small, scampering on agile legs, slipping between roots, their movements swift as sparks in the underbrush. Others grew larger, their limbs heavier, their jaws set with teeth sharp enough to tear through armored prey. The forest green was not just sanctuary, it was also battlefield, a place where hunger and caution measured every step. Above, the canopy was alive with insects more numerous than stars in the night sky. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than a man's outstretched arm darted through shafts of sunlight. Beetles, armored and ancient, crawled along bark that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Their buzzing, clicking, and droning became a kind of endless music, filling the space between silence and storm. And these insects, in their abundance, called to those who hunted them. Small lizards flicked their tongues, snapping at wings. Amphibians lunged from pools. Even the air was tested by wings, as the first gliding reptiles stretched membranes between elongated fingers and cast themselves into gravity's pull, learning how to fall like leaves. Every corner of these forests carried a rhythm of change. Mammal-like reptiles, synapse, patted slowly through the shade,
their bodies heavier, their teeth more varied, their eyes carrying a glint of intelligence sharpened by survival. They were neither quite reptile nor yet mammal, but something between, something transitional. In their bones lay the blueprint of fur and milk, of small creatures that would one day scurry unseen beneath the feet of giants. But in this age they stood taller, more dominant, some the size of wolves, others built for grazing, still others for tearing flesh. They stalked through the undergrowth, marking out territories, their lives bound to the green fringes where water and shelter could still be found. It is easy to imagine these forests as tranquil, a world of slow breezes and gentle rains, but to live here was to be caught in a constant exchange of risk and opportunity. To be small meant to hide, to adapt, to vanish into shadows before a larger predator noticed. To be large meant to defend, to dominate, to carry hunger across the land like a burning coal. In every clearing, every pool, every patch of moss and fern, survival was contested, and yet life flourished. This green belt was not uniform. In some places, swampy lowlands spread outward, thick with giant horsetails and tangled roots. Here, amphibians thrived, lurking in shallow waters. In others, drier forests of conifers stretched toward the horizon, home to reptiles built for speed and cunning. Along river deltas where fresh water met the sea, ecosystems bloomed in profusion, nurseries of fish and amphibians that spilled upward into the land. Each forest edge held a different balance, but together they circled Pangea like a living crown, a reminder that no matter how harsh the heart of the supercontinent became, the boundaries would always whisper with life. And within those whispers, a new story was beginning. The ancestors of creatures that would one day dominate Earth were learning their first lessons in these shadows. The first tentative experiments with warm-bloodedness, with parental care, with social hunting and long-term survival strategies were all seeded here, in places where forests touched the sea. The great deserts of the interior could only strip and erode, but the edges could grow, nurture, and invent. What seems today like a scattered collection of fossils and impressions in stone was once a living world, humming with countless voices. The green belts of Pangea were cradles of possibility. They held not just animals, but futures, and each rustling leaf carried the promise of worlds yet unseen. From this living margin, life would not only survive, but transform. Yet the forests were not eternal. The climate shifted, the seas rose and fell, and the balance of predator and prey tilted again and again. Still, in this moment of deep time, the forests along Pangea's coasts were alive with experiment, alive with sound and breath and struggle. And from these forests, we now step closer to the beings that defined them most vividly, the creatures that tested every path evolution could imagine.
From the shadowed edges of the coastal forests, where ferns rose like ancient cathedrals, and dragonflies buzzed with wings wide as a man's hand, the world of Pangea slowly began to change. What once was a realm of small scuttling creatures, amphibians that crept along the water's edge, reptiles that hugged the damp roots, and insects that hummed through humid air, was becoming something different, something larger, something heavier. The land, once dominated by the small, began to tremble with the first steps of giants. For countless millions of years, Earth's ecosystems had been balanced in delicate scales. Forests of tall lycophytes and tree-sized horsetails shaded the undergrowth, while amphibians slithered through shallow swamps, their bodies tied always to the water edge. They were creatures of twilight habitats, unable to stray too far from the moist refuge of their breeding grounds. But as the forests stretched further inland, and as climates shifted, a new kind of life rose, a life that was no longer bound to the water's edge. The reptiles, with their thick skins and shelled eggs, could march into the dry heart of the continent, and from these humble, scaly beginnings, the land was about to meet its first rulers. Imagine standing on a Pangean plain in the late Permian, the air heavy, the horizon vast. A shadow passes across the open land, not from a bird, for birds are still far in the future, but from something else, something heavier. You would see them emerging slowly, like dreams given form, the first great reptilian beasts. Among them were the parasaurs, their squat bodies armored with bony knobs, lumbering through the low greenery like tanks of flesh and bone. They were not fast nor sleek, but their size alone set them apart. Some grew longer than a man was tall, their bodies swaying as they dragged themselves from the fern-filled wetlands into the open sun. And then there were the gorgonopsids, the saber-toothed hunters of this deep age. Their skulls were long and narrow, lined with teeth like knives. They stalked the giants of the plains with a predator's patience, their bodies lean, their movements sharp. These were the ancestors of future mammal lines, the distant relatives of us who live today, and yet, in this time, they were apex hunters, unmatched beneath the red skies of the Permian. To walk near one would have been to feel the presence of a predator so alien and yet so strangely familiar, its stance echoing the lions and tigers that had not yet been imagined by the world. But even as these hunters and armored grazers roamed the forests and floodplains, stranger forms appeared. The Dimetrodon, its great sail rising high from its back like the fin of some forgotten ship, basked in the morning light, its blood warmed by the sun it absorbed. These sail-backed creatures grew to lengths of 4 meters, their jaws lined with serrated teeth. They were not dinosaurs, though many imagine them as such, but rather older lineages, testaments to life's endless experiments in form. Life in this age was still testing the boundaries of size. Creatures were learning, step by step, how to push against the limits of bone and muscle, how to anchor their weight to the earth, how to balance bulk with movement. And the land was learning too, for with giants came new cycles. Plants were grazed to the root. Predators chased prey across open floodplains. The balance of ecosystems shifted as weight itself became a strategy.
grow too large to be easily hunted, or grow strong enough to bring the large ones down. There is a rhythm to deep time, a slow swelling and receding, and here, with the first land giants, the rhythm grew louder. The Earth stage was being set for a drama that would only expand. Reptiles rising into forms stranger and stranger, landscapes echoing with the heavy steps of creatures that dwarfed all that came before. The forests at the coasts, the deserts at the heart, the mountains at the rim, these were no longer just backdrops of stone and leaf, but arenas where life itself began to test the scale of its ambition. And so, in this moment of Earth's deep story, something irreversible had begun. Giants had set foot upon the land. They were clumsy, perhaps, their bones not yet perfected, their bodies not yet elegant like those that would follow in the age of dinosaurs. But they were the beginning, the first drafts of grandeur, the first whispers of a world where weight and height and power would rule for ages untold. As the wind bent the tall ferns and the sails of Dimetrodon caught the light, a question settled into the soil of time. What would life do with this new path, this new appetite for size? What shapes would emerge given more time, more space, more chance to grow? The Earth, silent and patient, was waiting.
The story of Earth's living giants had only just begun. And yet, in the deep rhythm of time, the stage was already trembling beneath them. For in the shadow of Pangea's immensity, and in the fragile web of life woven across forests, swamps, and deserts, there lingered a gathering storm, one that would not come in a single moment, but would stretch itself out across thousands of years, a slow collapse that would leave scars lasting for ages. We call it the Permian-Triassic extinction, though to the creatures who lived through it, there was no name, no prophecy, only the steady unraveling of the world they had always known. It was a silence that began at the edges, like the dimming of a light one does not at first notice until all the flames are gone. Imagine the giants of the land, Dimetrodon, with its great sail arching like a banner above its back, the armored Pareasaurs, lumbering through fern groves, and the early ancestors of mammals, small but resilient, finding their place beneath the shadows of the great reptiles. These were creatures adapted to the rhythms of forests and rivers, deserts and swamps, each bound into the balance of their time. But balance, on a planet alive with restless geology, is never eternal. Beneath the crust of Pangea, forces were stirring. Deep fissures split open, releasing floods of molten rock across what is now Siberia, a volcanic outpouring so immense it covered millions of square kilometers. It was not just the fire that brought ruin, but the gases that rode upward with it: carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur, invisible breath that thickened the skies and warmed the seas. As the atmosphere shifted, the oceans too began to change. The waters warmed, circulation slowed, oxygen thinned. What had once been a cradle for life became instead a suffocating basin, where ancient reefs dissolved and the sea's abundance slipped into silence.
whole lineages of trilobites, creatures that had scuttled across the seafloor for nearly 300 million years, vanished entirely, their story ending in the black waters of stagnation. On land, forests withered. The coal swamps that had once flourished in damp belts across Pangea shrank, leaving behind bare landscapes where deserts spread. Rain patterns faltered, and in their absence the living tapestry of plants thinned. With them, the creatures who depended upon their shade and nourishment began to fall. For those who lived through this unraveling, it was not a sudden catastrophe, but a tightening noose, each generation born into a world slightly more fragile than the one before, until finally the weight of absence grew too great. Over 90% of species, creatures of sea and land alike, would vanish into extinction, their forms never to be seen again except in stone. And yet, even within this age of shadows, life did not wholly yield. Some endured, tiny burrowers scurrying through soil to escape the heat above, hardy reptiles able to withstand harsher droughts, seeds carried by the wind, waiting for rain that someday would return. These survivors bore within them the faint spark that in time would rekindle new forests, new seas, and new giants. To us, looking back across the gulf of deep time, the Permian extinction is a boundary, a dark seam in Earth's history that divides the world of the ancient past from the rise of the age yet to come. But to the Earth itself, it was another turning, another breath in the endless rhythm of creation and loss, growth and silence. And so, as the last shadows of the Permian settled, the great supercontinent of Pangea still stood, its deserts wide, its mountains rising, its coasts ringed with fading forests. But the world it held was not the same. The age of shadows had stripped away much of what had been, leaving behind a quieter, emptier earth, waiting for the slow renewal that would follow. In the stillness after loss, deep time teaches its most sobering lesson, that even the mightiest of eras can vanish, and yet from silence new voices will emerge. For beyond the ruin, the Triassic waited, and in its dawn, life would gather itself once more, rising from the bones of what had been, shaping the beginnings of yet another age of giants.
The silence that followed the great dying was not absolute, yet it was closer to emptiness than the earth had ever known. The end of the Permian had stripped life to its barest threads, leaving the land eerily barren, oceans ghostly quiet, and skies heavy with the residue of catastrophe. It was as though the world itself had drawn a long, broken breath, uncertain if it could exhale again. But slowly, against the stillness, life began to stir. At first there were only the smallest whispers. Hardy plants like seed ferns and conifers pushed fragile green tendrils through the ash-darkened soils. Their roots clung to places where moisture lingered, tracing the faint rivers and shallow basins that still carried the memory of water. Where these plants took hold, they became tiny oases, patches of green against a landscape that still remembered fire. And around them, the insects returned. Cockroaches, beetles, and dragonflies flitted above the greenery, their wings glinting in the pale light as if they carried fragments of the sun back into the wounded world.
But the land was not empty of vertebrates. Some had endured. Small lizard-like reptiles scurried across rocky ground, their nimble bodies proof of survival through sheer adaptability. Amphibians lingered in the wetter margins, descendants of an older age that had clung through fire and drought. And among them, strange new lineages began to rise. From the shadows of collapse emerged the first archosaurs, creatures whose posture and breath hinted at futures yet unseen. They were lean, fleet, and built for endurance, their skeletons whispering of the great reptiles that would one day rule. The Triassic dawn was fragile, yet it carried within it an energy of rebuilding. With so many ecological niches empty, evolution seemed to race forward, filling voids with new experiments. Strange synapsids, cousins of the mammalian line, prowled once again, though diminished from their former dominance. Some grew tusks, others bony crests, as though fashioning identities in a world stripped bare. Meanwhile, marine reptiles slid back into the seas. The ichthyosaurs, sleek and fish-like, took to the open waters, their bodies a promise that oceans too would recover. Alongside them, nothosaurs and placodonts appeared, swimming in shallow coasts, their limbs halfway between legs and fins. The seas, once emptied of their great communities, began to sing again with motion. Yet the world itself was restless. Pangea still stretched as one immense landmass, its center harsh and dry, its edges fringed by seas. Monsoons lashed its coasts, bringing cycles of drought and flood, shaping the rhythm of new life. Forests of conifers, cycads, and ginkgos grew in belts where rainfall persisted, offering shade to the survivors that clustered there. These forests would become sanctuaries, havens for experimentation, laboratories where the next great chapters of evolution would be written. And always, above the still fragile ecosystems, the climate remained unpredictable. Heat pressed down on the land, storms churned across oceans, and volcanic rumblings still scarred the horizon. Life had survived the Permian extinction, but the Earth itself seemed intent on testing its resilience again and again. Perhaps it was this very instability that drove life forward with such urgency, forcing it to adapt quickly, to change in ways that could not have been imagined in the calmer worlds of the past. From this crucible of instability emerged the first true forests of the Triassic, filled with towering trees that whispered in the hot winds. Within their shade, reptiles grew bolder. Some developed armored hides, like the atiosaurs, creatures plated with bony scales, wandering the floodplains like armored tanks of the Triassic. Others became predators, their teeth serrated, their bodies built for speed. The land was no longer the silent graveyard of the Permian, it was alive again. And with every new form that took shape, the shadows of extinction retreated just a little farther. The oceans, too, carried whispers of rebirth. Coral reefs slowly began to return, weaving their stony bodies into new underwater cities. Shoals of fish swam between them, flickering silver in the refracted light. Above, the ichthyosaurs sliced through waves with ease, their sleek dolphin-like forms chasing schools of prey. It was a reminder that even in the aftermath of ruin, the seas could not stay empty for long. They were too vast, too restless, too essential to life itself. And still, evolution pushed onward. Among the archosaurs, some grew taller, their limbs more upright, their strides more powerful. They began to dominate the open floodplains, claiming the spaces left vacant by the fallen synapsids. From their ranks, the first dinosaurs would eventually emerge, though at this early stage they were but whispers, small and quick, unnoticed against the larger reptiles that ruled around them. But the seeds of their destiny had been sown, hidden in bone and breath, waiting for time to draw them upward. The dawn after darkness was not sudden. It was slow, uneven, and fragile. Every gain could still be undone by drought, by fire, by storms, yet life had proven its resilience once more. Against all odds, it had begun again. And in these first steps of recovery, it carried within it the blueprints of futures grander than any yet seen. Because from the silence of extinction, the story of the Mesozoic was beginning to rise. And within that story, the earth would soon bear witness to creatures unlike any that had ever walked before, creatures whose shadows still echo across stone and memory, even today.
Out of the fragile dawn of the Triassic, where silence had reigned and the world had been rebuilt from ash and shadow, there began to appear creatures unlike those that had walked before. They were small at first, so small you might have overlooked them among the reeds of a riverbank or in the hush of twilight where insects stirred the air. But their presence was quiet only in size. In destiny, it was monumental. These were the first footsteps of the dinosaurs, tentative but steady, carrying with them the whispers of ages yet to unfold. The land was still reshaping itself after the great dying. Pangea stretched in one unbroken sweep across the globe, its deserts vast, its coasts humid, its rivers slow-moving veins across a restless surface. Life was fragile here, stitched together from survivors, balanced on narrow edges. But in that fragility lay opportunity, a space where something new could grow, where the old rulers had fallen and the stage had been left waiting. The ancestors of the dinosaurs were archosaurs, reptilian in form, but carrying within them a design of quiet innovation. They stood a little more upright than those who had come before, their limbs angled beneath them rather than sprawling to the side. It was a simple change, yet profound. This posture freed their breath, gave them speed, endurance, the ability to move with lightness over long distances. It was as though the earth itself had been preparing them to inherit its open plains, its wide deserts, its endless stretches of time. At first, they were not giants, not the towering beings that later ages would remember. They were small, fleet-footed, weaving through ferns and horsetails, no larger than a dog or a fox. Their bones were delicate, their steps almost fragile. But in that delicacy lay resilience. They did not need to be immense yet. They only needed to endure, to explore, to try, to place their quiet tracks on the soft earth of Pangea. Imagine one of them moving through the forests of the coastal belts, the light of evening sifting through tall trees. It pauses alert, its narrow head lifting to catch the sound of a breeze. It has no inkling that it carries within it a legacy that will one day fill the skies with wings and the continents with thunder. It only survives, step by step, as the world allows it to. Yet survival is the first seed of destiny, and here that seed had been planted. Other creatures still shared the land,
mammal-like reptiles that clung to their shrinking dominion, amphibians that haunted rivers and marshes, predators that prowled under the burning sun. Competition was fierce, but competition had always been the architect of transformation. The archosaurs, light-bodied and efficient, began to outlast, outpace, and outmaneuver the others. They found the cracks in the world where life could still flourish, and in those cracks, their footsteps multiplied. The first dinosaurs were not yet rulers. They were wanderers. They were survivors of chance, their forms honed not by ambition, but by adaptation. Their steps left patterns across the margins of Pangea, imprinted in mud and silt that hardened into stone. Some of those prints remain today, silent and enduring, telling us of beings who never knew they were walking into eternity. The rhythm of their existence was quiet, steady, almost unremarkable in its beginnings. Yet time was patient, and time is where the small becomes great. Each step they placed across the earth was a rehearsal for the symphony of thunder that would one day echo across deserts and plains, mountains and forests. From those fragile beginnings, the first footsteps, light as whispers, the age of dinosaurs began.
The quiet Triassic world, still stitched together by the single vast landmass of Pangea, was a place of recovery, of cautious rebuilding after the shadows of extinction had nearly swept life away. In this fragile dawn, small archosaurs crept, stalked, and waited, testing their steps upon the soils of survival. Among them, in the warm lowlands and across the margins of rivers, something new was stirring. They were not yet the giants of legend, not yet the thunder lizards of later ages, but they were the beginnings, the first true dinosaurs. At first, they were unassuming, creatures no larger than a dog, light-boned, long-tailed, their hind limbs built for quickness, their forelimbs slim and agile. They moved with a curious balance, rising onto their back legs for bursts of speed, lowering again to forage or to stalk. Their eyes gleamed with a restless sharpness, and their lungs pulled air through delicate passages, more efficient than those of most creatures that surrounded them. Everything about them whispered of something that was coming, a march not of armies, but of evolution itself. The world they inherited was still sparse. Forests had begun to spread again across floodplains and deltas. Cycads rose in groves, their stiff leaves reaching like serrated fans toward the sun. Horsetail reeds clustered thickly near riversides, swaying in the warm breezes. Ferns carpeted shaded valleys, weaving green where once there had been only bare stone. Insects droned and clicked in the undergrowth, ancient ancestors of flies and beetles humming their endless songs. This was the stage upon which the early dinosaurs began to walk. They were not alone. Around them prowled the great predators of the age, crocodile-like reptiles with armored hides and jaws filled with knife-shaped teeth. These were the rulers of the Triassic, hunters that had survived the extinctions and flourished in the emptiness left behind. They were larger, stronger, heavier than the early dinosaurs, and at first it seemed that the new arrivals would remain small, forever overshadowed by the crocodilian masters of the rivers and plains. But the dinosaurs carried with them quiet advantages. Their limbs angled beneath their bodies, not sprawling outward like the reptiles of old. This gave them speed, endurance, and a kind of grace. Their lungs drew in oxygen with steady efficiency, cooling their bodies even under the blaze of the Triassic sun. They could travel farther, run longer, recover faster. And slowly, step by step, stride by stride, they began to carve their place into the tapestry of life. Some became nimble predators, chasing small lizards, insects, and even the hatchlings of other reptiles. Others were plant-eaters, nibbling tender shoots of cycads and ferns, testing the greenery with jaws adapted for clipping and grinding. They lived in groups, it seems, gathering in the margins of forests, darting across open floodplains. Where danger pressed too close, they scattered like shadows. Where opportunity opened, they surged forward. The Triassic sun set upon their small silhouettes, long tails trailing behind them, feet pressing into the damp mud of ancient riverbanks. Their tracks pressed into the soft earth, hardened in time, and were buried beneath layers of sand and silt. Millions of years later, these faint imprints would be uncovered by human hands, delicate signatures of beings at the very beginning of a reign that would one day reshape the earth. And though they were small, their march was steady. Like a quiet current flowing beneath the surface of time, the dinosaurs advanced. Slowly, they grew in number. Slowly, they spread across the vast interior of Pangea, following rivers, climbing valleys, venturing toward coasts. They were never in a hurry, for the patience of evolution is long, and the work of deep time unfolds not in decades, but in millions upon millions of years. In the stillness of the Triassic night, with stars scattered across skies that looked down upon a single vast continent, the first dinosaurs moved softly. They did not yet roar, they did not yet shake the earth, but they endured. And endurance in the quiet halls of survival is the first step toward dominance. The march had begun, a march that would one day echo through forests of towering conifers, across plains that would tremble under the weight of giants, through swamps where long-necked titans would graze the sky. It was still distant, still unimaginable in this fragile dawn, but here, in the hush of deep time, the story was beginning to turn. And as the Triassic drew on, with climates shifting and landscapes unfolding, the march of the early dinosaurs would not stop. Step by step, age by age, they would move forward into a future written in bones and stone. From the small beginnings of those early bird-hipped and lizard-hipped wanderers, time once again stretched its hand across the ages, shaping their fragile bones into something greater, something destined to fill the world with awe. The early dinosaurs, light-footed and sharp-eyed, had been survivors, quick and lean, thriving in the broken landscapes left by extinction. But as the Triassic bled into the Jurassic, the Earth itself seemed to open space for them to grow, to test the boundaries of size and strength, and to reach toward a new kind of grandeur. The world was changing again. The supercontinent Pangea, which had once gathered all lands into one, was beginning to pull itself apart at the seams. Rifts split through the crust,
birthing valleys that yawned into oceans. With each slow drift, coastlines lengthened, climates shifted, and fertile ground spread outward like green invitations. Where once the center of the world had been dry and barren, now forests of ferns and cycads unfurled in humid warmth, fed by rains that gathered in monsoons. Vast floodplains stretched beside rivers, and it was into this lush, expanding world that the dinosaurs began to grow, their bodies responding to abundance in ways unseen before. It began with the sauropodomorphs, small at first, walking on two legs and nibbling low plants. But time sculpted them larger, heavier, and hungrier. Their necks lengthened, their backs broadened, and their legs grew like pillars that no longer needed to rise into the air, but could stand like columns beneath cathedrals of flesh. Slowly, step by patient step, they left behind the quick grace of their ancestors and became something altogether new: giants. Imagine the first of them, still modest by the standards of what would come, yet already dwarfing the creatures of earlier ages. They grazed on the forests, pulling down fronds and branches with necks that could sweep like arcs of moving bridges. Their bodies carried entire ecosystems upon them, insects buzzing at their hides, small lizards darting through the shadow of their feet. With every shift of weight, the earth quivered, and yet they were gentle in their own way, living on plants, endlessly feeding, endlessly moving like rivers of life across the plains. But where giants rise, so too do hunters. The meat-eating dinosaurs, once little more than wiry shadows darting after insects and small prey, also began their climb toward power. Their skulls grew stronger, their jaws sharper, and their tails longer for balance, and their limbs more muscular. The early theropods, cousins of the swift archosaurs, discovered dominance in flesh and fang. They learned to test the edges of the herds, to isolate the weak, to chase and bring down prey much larger than themselves. It was here, in the balance between towering herbivores and cunning predators, that the stage of the Jurassic began to take shape. The earth was no longer the quiet, recovering ground of the Triassic. It had become alive with thunder. The sauropods, descendants of those first long-necked forms, pushed further still, breaking the limits of size. Evolution poured into them as though the planet itself wanted to know how large a creature could become. Neck upon neck stretched upward, so high that they could strip trees no other animal could touch. Their tails extended like whips of muscle, some longer than the length of 3 houses, strong enough to break the sound barrier if swung. Their hearts pumped rivers of blood through bodies the size of small hills. They became walking continents, their lives measured not in moments of flight, but in endless migrations from forest to forest. And the theropods, those shadows of teeth and sinew, grew to match them. Some became hunters of speed, darting with precision to wound and exhaust their prey. Others grew larger, jaws wide enough to snap bone, their eyes steady and unblinking as they studied the herds. They carried in their stride a new kind of authority, for they had become apex forms, their lives written in the chase and the kill. This was the age when the earth began to echo with 2 sounds that marked the rhythm of life: the thunder of feet and the cry of predators. Together they shaped the ecosystems of the Jurassic. The herds moved, the hunters followed, and the forests bent to their endless cycle.
The land seemed vast enough for all of them, for the world was opening into continents and seas that made space for abundance. But beyond the grandeur of size, something else stirred quietly within these creatures, the early whispers of diversity. Some sauropods carried necks that arched gracefully, feeding at the high canopies, while others kept their heads low, sweeping the ground. Some theropods shrank instead of growing, finding new lives as quick and agile hunters of smaller prey. Evolution was painting with a broad brush, exploring every form, every niche, as if the earth were writing a grand experiment in scale. And so the small shadows of the Triassic gave way to giants of the Jurassic, both gentle and fierce, filling the world with a rhythm that would last for tens of millions of years. The age of dinosaurs had moved beyond its first steps. It was now walking with immense weight, shaping landscapes with its presence and defining ecosystems with its very breath. The world, once quiet after extinction, now resounded with a living roar, a harmony of abundance that would echo through deep time. And yet here, even among the giants, the story was only beginning, for evolution's hand had not finished its work. Something greater still was on the horizon, waiting in the folds of time to emerge.
The earth shifted under their weight, not in sudden quakes, but in the deep, slow compression of soil pressed for centuries by feet the size of boulders. The reign of the sauropods had begun, and the world itself seemed to stretch upward to meet their impossible forms. From the warm basins of the Jurassic, forests thick with conifers, cycads, and ginkgos became their kingdoms. The air was heavy with the scent of resin, the skies hazy with humidity, and beneath those canopy tops rose the long necks of creatures that dwarfed almost every living thing before them. Diplodocus, with its graceful sweep of spine and whip-like tail. Brachiosaurus, towering like a moving hill, its forelimbs longer than its hind, lifting its head above the tree crowns as if it sought to taste the sky itself. And Apatosaurus, broad and solid, each step like the steady stroke of a drumbeat echoing across the floodplains. The world had changed to suit them, or perhaps they had changed to master the world. In the warm Jurassic, oxygen was rich, plants abundant, and seasons gentle enough to allow for growth without ceasing. Trees climbed toward the heavens, and in turn the sauropods reached even higher, stretching upward in a slow arms race of trunks and necks. Wherever vegetation grew, they followed, their teeth not sharp for tearing, but shaped like rakes and pegs, perfect for stripping branches, swallowing leaves, and moving on, endlessly moving on. To watch them would have been to feel small, to sense time as something beyond human scale. For they lived not as solitary beasts, but in herds that moved like tides across the land. Mothers walked with young, shielding them with their sheer bulk, while the older bulls wandered in parallel arcs, casting long shadows across the plains. The earth beneath such herds became pathways pressed smooth,
tracks sunken into mud that would fossilize as silent echoes millions of years later. Predators lurked, but even the sharpest jaws faltered before the immensity of these giants. Allosaurus, with its teeth curved like daggers, hunted where it could, but it was the young, the sick, the isolated that fell. Never the heart of the herd, never the mountain that moved as one. For sauropods, survival was in their scale, their strength, their ceaseless unity. And still, there was a strange gentleness to their reign. They were not destroyers of forests, but shapers of them. As they fed, they pruned the canopy, letting sunlight spill to the forest floor, encouraging new growth, creating mosaics of life where smaller creatures thrived. Their passage opened clearings where ferns spread, where insects swarmed, where the earliest mammals darted in the shadows, safe beneath the wake of titans. This was an age when the rhythm of life pulsed to the step of giants. Across continents that were still bound in Pangea's embrace, herds migrated along rivers, through valleys, over floodplains that stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles. They carried with them not only their hunger, but the seeds of the plants they consumed, scattering life as they walked, reshaping landscapes with every breath, every movement, every shadow. To stand at the edge of such a scene would have been to witness deep time made flesh. The sound of branches cracking high above, the low thunder of footsteps, the hiss of tails slicing the air, and between those sounds long silences, as if the world itself paused in awe of its living mountains. But even in this age of plenty there was no permanence. The earth itself was shifting beneath them, tectonic plates grinding, seas opening, continents drifting apart. With each slow division, climates shifted, deserts crept in, and forests retreated. The reign of the sauropods was not a single moment, but a long unfolding reign stretched across millions of years, punctuated by change, challenge, and renewal. Still, for a time, for an age long beyond human reckoning, they stood unchallenged, the masters not of violence, but of endurance. Not of cunning, but of sheer presence. They ruled not with claws or fangs, but with the quiet inevitability of size and time. And so as the Jurassic sun rose and set, casting gold across their vast silhouettes, the sauropods became the very emblem of life's boundless reach. A reminder that in the story of Earth there are moments when life does not merely survive, but ascends, becoming something so grand it shapes the world simply by existing. The earth still carries their echoes, pressed into stone, written in footprints that march across fossilized floodplains. And though their reign would one day fade, their shadows linger in every reminder of life's hunger for greatness, for height, for endless expansion toward the sky. The reign of the sauropods was not simply an age of giants. It was the age when life itself learned how far it could reach and how vast a creature could become before even time itself whispered of change.
They say that in every age of abundance, shadows gather, and in the green, steaming world of the Jurassic, where the sauropods thundered like living mountains across the plains, shadows indeed sharpened their claws and learned to move in silence. For no giant, no matter how vast, can truly reign without challengers, and the earth, ever balancing its scales, summoned hunters to match the grazers who grew beyond imagination. These hunters were not titans of size, not at first, but titans of design, bodies sculpted by speed, by agility, by the hunger written deep in bone. Where the sauropods raised their necks into the canopies, the hunters slipped through the underbrush, their tails stretched like counterweights, their claws hooked like blades, their teeth sharp crescents of polished ivory. They were the balancing act of nature, the tether holding the thunder of giants in check. In the warmth of Pangea's broken fragments, ecosystems grew dense and layered. Rivers cut through fern valleys, lakes shimmered with the haze of dragonflies larger than a man's hand. And into this stage came the predators of the Jurassic. Not one kind, not one lineage, but many, a shifting cast of hunters, some no taller than a person's knee, darting after lizards and early mammals, and others already rising toward the throne of dominance, stalking the sauropods that grazed beneath cycads and conifers. Among them were the ceratosaurs, long-snouted, muscular, their jaws lined with teeth suited for tearing flesh. They were among the first great hunters of this age, moving with the swiftness of cats, their bodies lean, their legs springing. In the stillness of twilight, when the shadows stretched long, one could imagine them slipping from the tree line, eyes fixed, nostrils flaring, every tendon primed for the chase. And then came the allosaurs, those early kings of the hunt. Not the largest predators Earth would ever know, but balanced, efficient, perfected for their moment in time. With skulls built like blunt wedges, lined with serrated knives of bone, and arms strong enough to rake prey, they were the rising masters of the Jurassic Plains. They lived in numbers, not always as solitary stalkers, but sometimes gathering near carcasses, drawn together by scent, feeding in the chaos of tearing flesh and the thunder of wings overhead as pterosaurs circled for scraps. When an allosaur moved, the land seemed to tense. The smaller animals scattered, the forests grew still, and only the boldest of scavengers lingered in their shadow. Against the sauropods, they were but gnats to mountains. Yet numbers and patience turned gnats into storms. It is thought that these hunters, clever in ways written not in language but in instinct, may have harried the giants, isolating the young, the weak, the weary, for even the greatest of creatures are vulnerable when hunger sharpens its edge. This was the age where balance became theater. The sauropods did not walk unchallenged. They were tested, again and again, by jaws that sought the soft parts of their flanks, by teeth that glistened with blood. It was not always victory for the hunters. A single sweep of a tail, a single crush of a colossal foot could scatter the bravest pack. Yet failure is written into the laws of predation, and from failure, persistence grows. Other hunters filled the shadows too. Ornitholestes, swift and narrow-skulled, a creature of speed rather than brute strength, darted through ferns and cycads,
chasing smaller prey. Dilophosaurs, their twin crests rising from narrow heads, carried with them the remnants of earlier ages, still formidable in their craft. And in the underbrush, countless small carnivores hunted in silence, weaving through a web of life where every niche was filled with hunger's answer. But it was Allosaurus, above all, that became the symbol of this chapter in Earth's story, the hunter that stood at the edge of myth. Its bones littered the fossil beds of places we now call Utah and Colorado, graveyards where giants and hunters lay entwined, their struggles preserved in stone. In those silent monuments, one can almost hear the thunder of the chase, the bellow of a wounded sauropod, the frenzy of feeding when the balance of life tilted, if only for a moment, toward the shadow. And so, the Jurassic was not merely an age of peace beneath towering herbivores, but a time of ceaseless tension. Predator and prey shaped one another like sculptors working in opposition, driving evolution forward with every struggle, with every chase. Giants grew taller, heavier, stronger. Predators grew swifter, more cunning, more relentless. This was the endless dance of survival unfolding beneath the steaming canopies of the Jurassic world, a rhythm both brutal and beautiful. The sauropods may have ruled the daylight with their towering presence, but it was the hunters, patient and tireless, who wrote the counterpoint, a reminder that no reign stands unchallenged, that even in the golden ages of life, the shadow always waits at the edge of the forest. And from this interplay, this balance of thunder and silence, of mountain and claw, Earth was already whispering the prelude of what was yet to come. For the hunters of the Jurassic were only the beginning. Their descendants would grow larger, fiercer, more cunning still. The age of shadows was sharpening, and though the sauropods still walked in majesty, their every step was trailed by eyes that gleamed in hunger, and by a future that would birth monsters even greater than Allosaurus, rising from the darkness of time.
Above the heavy-footed sauropods, above the stalking predators with their sharp teeth and watchful eyes, a new theater of life had already begun to spread its wings, as if the earth itself longed to lift some of its children away from the weight of soil and stone. The skies of the Jurassic were no longer empty, no longer silent passages where only winds howled and storms gathered, but alive with shapes both delicate and vast, with beating wings that cast fleeting shadows upon the forests and rivers below. These were the pterosaurs, masters of the air long before birds would come to claim that mantle, and in their presence the Earth's drama grew into a story that unfolded not only on land and in water, but high above in the open blue. Their wings were not made of feathers, but of skin stretched tight across elongated fingers, like sails woven from living flesh, catching the currents of air as surely as a ship catches the sea. Some were small, darting like dragonflies as they hunted insects above the canopy, their wings whispering softly as they flickered from branch to branch. Others grew larger, their wingspans stretching across the length of a man, then across the span of two men, and later even more. They soared like shadows of clouds, rising with the thermals, spiraling high, then plunging down toward rivers where fish glittered beneath the surface, or coasts where the waves rolled endlessly, offering prey with every tide.
They were strange creatures, fragile in appearance, yet powerful in design. Their bones were hollow, lighter than those of their land-bound kin, their bodies lean and built for the sky. Long crests adorned the heads of some, rising like sails or blades, their shapes perhaps guiding their balance in flight, perhaps signals to one another in displays of courtship or rivalry, perhaps even both at once. When they gathered at cliff sides, their calls would echo over the waves, a chorus as wild as the sea itself. And when they took off in unison, it was as though the land itself had released a storm of living kites. On the shores of lagoons, you might have seen them perched upon rocks, wings folded awkwardly, their limbs like crooked shadows. But when the wind caught them, and they lifted, all awkwardness fell away. They were grace embodied, masters of a realm that no giant hunter could touch. Even the great predators of the Jurassic forests could only tilt their heads skyward, watching as these creatures rode currents invisible to those who walked the ground. But the skies of the Jurassic were not empty highways open to anyone who could climb into them. They were arenas of competition, where the early birds, tiny feathered descendants of their archosaur kin, began to take their first timid flights, flitting among branches with feathers more suited for gliding than true soaring. Against the mighty pterosaurs, they seemed insignificant, like sparks against a storm. Yet they marked the beginning of another thread in life's tapestry. For though the pterosaurs reigned, casting their silhouettes across the world for millions of years, one day their skies would not be their own. In this age, however, they were unchallenged, filling the air in ways no creature before them had dreamed. They swept across open plains where herds of sauropods browsed below, diving down to snap at insects stirred by their feet. They hovered over rivers rich with fish, plunging suddenly, their long jaws closing around a silver prize. And they ventured even into the far reaches of the sea, resting on waves, then taking off again, their wings skimming the water, as though the ocean itself were their second home. At night, as the sun fell behind the hills and the forests darkened, their wings carried them home to roosts high upon cliffs and ridges where no predator could climb. The wind would tug at them as they settled, folding their wings around them like cloaks. Below, the forests whispered with the calls of creatures hidden in shadow, but above, in the stillness of starlight, the pterosaurs owned the silence. They had claimed a kingdom that no teeth, no claws, no towering giant could ever conquer. With wings, life had entered its next dimension. The earth, once a world of crawling forms upon the ground, now became a world of flight, where horizons were not barriers but invitations. From the steaming jungles of the coasts to the wide wind-swept plains, the sky had become alive, and it would remain so as long as these rulers of air endured. And still, beneath their silent flight, the ground shook with the weight of giants, the rivers curled through forests of green, and the hunters prowled with unbroken hunger. Life was now a threefold story, in the depths of rivers and seas, upon the heavy soil of earth, and in the boundless expanse of air. The Jurassic was not merely an age of giants, but an age of dimensions, each layer filled with life that mirrored and answered the others. And above them all, wings whispered the song of freedom, writing a new chapter across the canvas of the sky.
The world that had for so long been a single boundless stage, Pangea, stretching like an endless bridge of stone across the curve of the earth, now began to tremble at its edges. It was not sudden, not a violent shattering at once, but rather the slow, patient breath of the planet itself, exhaling through cracks, shifting with deep murmurs that no creature could hear, yet all would eventually feel. Molten rivers far below the crust stirred, pressing upward in long, invisible tides. Mountains quivered in their roots. Seas sought new basins to fill. And through these deep tremors, the very floor beneath forests, deserts, and swamps began to drift apart, as if the skin of the earth itself were learning to divide. For countless ages, the supercontinent had been the keeper of life's unity, its immense landmass binding together the destinies of animals and plants, drawing winds across deserts, pulling rains toward forests, and balancing climates between north and south. But now, as its seams began to stretch, the harmony was gently undone. A slow unweaving, a drifting of continents like leaves across a dark pond, their separation shaping not only the face of the land, but the fate of all who walked upon it. Forests that once spread like an unbroken carpet now found themselves divided. Great belts of trees, once continuous, now isolated by widening seas and shifting climates. Creatures who had roamed freely across plains without end now faced boundaries they had never known, invisible walls of salt water that thickened year by year until they became true barriers, severing one population from another, leaving cousins stranded on opposite shores. The climate, too, began to stir restlessly. As oceans widened, currents shifted, winds changed their ancient paths. Regions that had once basked in steady warmth found themselves cooling, while others grew hotter, harsher, more unpredictable. Deserts bloomed where forests had stood, and swamps retreated into narrow ribbons along rivers. The delicate balance of ecosystems trembled with each shift, forcing life to bend, adapt, or fade into memory. For the dinosaurs, still young in their reign, this breaking of the world was both a challenge and a gift. Small, swift hunters and plant-eaters found themselves isolated in pockets of land, their lineages diverging, branching into forms uniquely suited to their changing homes. In the north, where climates cooled, some grew hardier, able to endure harsher seasons. In the south, under suns that burned hotter, others grew into new shapes, exploring sizes and diets no ancestors had known. This slow parting of the supercontinent became the hidden architect of diversity. It was as though the earth itself were conducting an ancient experiment,
splitting the stage into many smaller theaters with each its own cast, its own unfolding drama. Where once there had been one story of life, now there would be many, diverging and multiplying in endless variation. The seas, too, swelled with change. New coastlines were born as land tore itself apart, birthing shallow waters that teemed with life. Reefs expanded, rich with corals and shellfish, feeding fish that glimmered in vast schools, which in turn drew the sleek shadows of marine hunters. The oceans, like the land, were no longer bound to one shape, but began to fracture into separate worlds, each with its own balance, its own rhythm. Above all, the earth itself seemed alive in a new way. Great rift valleys opened like wounds, spilling lava that glowed under alien skies. Vast mountain chains rose as continents pressed against one another, folding stone into jagged peaks that pierced the clouds. Earthquakes rumbled through the bones of the land, and geysers hissed where molten heat found cracks to the surface. The world was not still. It was restless, alive, remaking itself. For those who dwelt upon it, the changes were slow enough that no single lifetime could see their full arc. Yet in the deep time of Earth's memory, this was a moment of great transformation, a pivot on which the destiny of life would turn. The breaking of Pangea was not merely the drifting of stone, but the opening of possibility, the creation of countless new worlds where evolution could weave its endless tapestry. And so the stage was set for a new age. The dinosaurs, scattered across separating lands, would take many forms, each shaped by its corner of the divided earth. Giants would rise, swift hunters would sharpen their claws, and in hidden corners, small creatures would prepare for futures unimaginable. The earth had fractured, but from its breaking, life itself would find new ways to flourish. The single world was gone, but in its place, many worlds were about to be born. The world is no longer one. The unity of Pangea, that vast singular landmass, has fractured into drifting continents, each moving silently upon the deep currents of the Earth's mantle, carrying with them entire ecosystems like great floating arcs. Where once deserts stretched endlessly across the heart of a supercontinent, now coastlines multiply, seas intrude, and climates soften into a mosaic of forests, wetlands, and plains. This breaking, though violent in its geological power, becomes a gift to life, for separation creates diversity, and isolation breeds innovation. And so begins what many call the golden age of the dinosaurs, an age when their forms explode into a dazzling spectrum of size, shape, and purpose. On some lands, towering sauropods roam in herds across new valleys, their necks swaying like ships' masts against the horizon. On others, plated stegosaurs wander in silence, their spines rising like living battlements, while predatory allosaurs move among them, shadows of hunger balanced by the abundance of prey. Forests thicken in humid corners of the world,
And in their shadows, smaller dinosaurs flourish, swift runners, feathered forms, the precursors of new possibilities yet unseen. The climate itself becomes a painter, brushing new colors upon the canvas of life. Warmer, wetter regions cradle lush ferns and towering conifers, giving herbivores endless feasts, while drier lands shape leaner, tougher creatures, adapted to scarcity and heat. This variety of environments, multiplied by the drifting continents, becomes the engine of a vast evolutionary experiment where chance and adaptation intertwine in quiet competition. In this age, the balance of land, sea, and sky is more complete than ever before. The sauropods hold dominion over the ground, their sheer mass turning landscapes into living stages. Predators stalk between them, never truly in control, but always vital to the endless cycle of life and death. Above, the pterosaurs soar, their wings cutting across the winds, searching rivers and coastlines for fish and carrion. And beneath the waves, the marine reptiles continue their silent mastery, their bodies tuned to the rhythm of the tides. Together, they create a three-dimensional symphony of life, a chorus of motion that fills every corner of the planet. Yet within this golden age, there is also fragility. The same drifting continents that give birth to diversity also shift climates in ways that bring droughts, storms, and floods. Volcanoes lace the air with ash, turning seasons uncertain, and the seas rise and fall as the Earth's crust bends beneath the restless mantle. Still, the dinosaurs endure, and not merely endure, they thrive. Their numbers swelling across every continent, their forms adapting faster than the world can break them. It is in this age that the seeds of future lineages are planted. Some small feathered dinosaurs learn to chase insects among the branches, their bodies light, their movements precise, unknowingly walking the first steps toward becoming birds. Others refine the tools of predation, longer legs, sharper teeth, keener eyes, shaping the predators that will one day rule entire continents. And still others experiment with defense, with horns, frills, and armor, as if the Earth itself encourages diversity not only in size and diet, but in the very architecture of survival. This golden age is not a single moment, but a stretch of millions of years, a quiet reign that feels eternal in its rhythm. To live within it would be to see abundance on a scale difficult to imagine. Valleys echoing with the calls of countless species, skies darkened by wings at dusk, rivers stirred by massive bodies waiting to drink. It is a world at its height, a world seemingly secure in its prosperity. Yet history whispers otherwise. Every golden age carries within it the seeds of its end. The continents drift ever farther apart, reshaping currents, altering climates, building pressures beneath the Earth that will one day erupt. The balance, though it feels eternal, is fragile, and time waits with silent patience to tip it once more. But for now, in this chapter of Earth's story, the dinosaurs reign as undisputed sovereigns, their forms sculpting the land, their shadows falling across every forest and plain. The Earth is theirs, as fully as it will ever be, and for a time it seems that nothing could break the spell of their golden age. The golden age of the dinosaurs glowed across the continents like a great sprawling canvas of life. Towering sauropods still grazed across plains that seemed endless. Predatory giants still stalked with their relentless patience. The skies still held their flocks of pterosaurs drifting like living sails, while the oceans still shimmered with reptilian hunters moving like shadows beneath the surface. It seemed as though the ancient world had settled into a perfect rhythm of survival and abundance, a harmony that might last forever. And yet, as so often in Earth's story, the true revolutions began not with thunder, but with whispers. Across the lush green of the Cretaceous, small plants unfurled petals. The first flowers, delicate, fleeting, almost invisible against the might of dinosaurs, began to bloom. Their blossoms were quiet bursts of color beneath the great ferns and conifers, tiny flares of fragrance and pollen that drifted into the air, carried by insects that had never before been given such nectar to seek. This was no sudden explosion, no single dawn. It was a slow and patient unfolding, as if the earth herself was experimenting in secret, first with blossoms shaped for beetles, then for flies, later for the delicate attention of bees that would one day become their perfect partners. Each new bloom a subtle negotiation between plant and pollinator, a quiet dance of survival that rewrote the rules of life without the dinosaurs even noticing. But the change was vast, even if it was unseen at first. Flowering plants, the angiosperms, would spread their seeds in new ways, carried in fruit, in grains, in pods designed to tempt and reward animals. They would rise not only in number, but in influence, reshaping landscapes that had been dominated for hundreds of millions of years by cycads, horsetails, and towering conifers. The earth itself seemed to soften under their spread. Meadows and glades of blossoms appeared where once only dark forests stood. Fields of early grasses shimmered faintly in the breeze. The colors of the world became richer, more layered, more complex, as petals brought reds, yellows, whites, and purples into a land that had known mostly greens and browns for so long. And with the flowers came new possibilities for the creatures who lived among them. Herbivorous dinosaurs, once content with the coarse fare of ferns and pine needles, began to encounter richer food, more energy packed into leaves and seeds, more diversity to graze upon. Some adapted quickly, their beaks and teeth shifting to pluck, grind, and crush the bounty. Others resisted, clinging to the ancient diet of their forebears. The air grew alive with new scents. Insects followed these blossoms in growing numbers, evolving alongside them, drawn into a pact that would outlast empires of stone and bone. Buzzing wings stitched paths across the summer air, carrying life from bloom to bloom, turning the world into a great web of exchange and renewal. Still the giants walked, the hunters prowled, the oceans thundered, the skies glided. The dinosaurs did not yet know that the ground beneath their feet was quietly shifting, that the balance of power within the plants they depended on was being rewritten leaf by leaf, petal by petal. The Cretaceous, golden and grand, became also a season of subtle beauty, of blossoms beneath the shadows of titans.
And as the flowers spread, they whispered a truth the world had always known, but the giants had forgotten, that sometimes it is not the mighty who shape the ages, but the small, the delicate, the patient. The world of dinosaurs was still in its prime, still vast, still breathtaking, still radiant with life. But beneath their heavy footsteps, a revolution of blossoms was quietly preparing the future. And soon this quiet tide of color would be joined by other forces, other storms that would test the reign of the giants, carrying the story forward toward both splendor and shadow.
The world had been moving toward this for millions of years, and now, in the heart of the Cretaceous, the age of the dinosaurs burned at its brightest flame, a golden zenith of diversity and scale where every corner of the planet seemed to pulse with life. On the broad plains of what would one day be North America, immense herds of hadrosaurs, the duck-billed grazers with their crests and calls, moved in sweeping migrations like rivers of muscle and scale, their numbers so vast that the ground itself trembled under their passage, their footprints pressing the earth into a living map of their dominion. Among them stalked the great predators of their time, most fearsome of all, the towering tyrannosaurs, apex hunters whose jaws carried the crushing force of bone-breaking thunder, whose gaze cut through dust and distance, marking the weak, the young, the straying. Their presence cast a shadow of primal dread across the land. And yet it was this balance of fear and survival that kept the plains alive in eternal tension. Elsewhere, armored giants stood as living fortresses, the ankylosaurs with their clubs of bone, the ceratopsians with their vast frills and horns like banners of war, guardians of their herds and defenders of their young, their clashes echoing like ancient drums across the meadows of the Mesozoic world. And in the skies, great pterosaurs ruled the winds, their wingspans stretching wider than any bird that would ever follow, the heavens alive with their gliding silhouettes, casting moving shadows across the wetlands and coasts below, where flocks of newly risen birds, smaller but swifter, feathered descendants of raptors, began testing their own mastery of the air. The seas, too, mirrored this grandeur, filled with the leviathans of the deep, mosasaurs, serpentine and vast, patrolling their kingdoms with predatory grace, plesiosaurs with their long necks like living serpents of the waves, ichthyosaurs still darting through the currents, swift as fish, but built like predators of steel, each ocean basin a theater of survival, where life could grow vast, but never complacent. Everywhere one looked, from deserts to forests, mountains to deltas, life had specialized, adapted, and thrived in forms more varied than ever before. From tiny mammals scurrying unseen in the shadows of leaf litter, waiting for a future that had not yet come, to the dinosaurs themselves, who stood as the supreme rulers of their age, seemingly eternal, seemingly invincible, seemingly woven into the fabric of the earth itself. And yet, even here, at their height, the first faint whispers of change stirred in the background, subtle, invisible, but certain.
Continents continued to drift further apart, climates shifted in patches, seas rose and receded, flowers spread slowly outward, reshaping the diets of herbivores and with them the strategies of their hunters. For now, however, this was their world in full glory, the apex of their reign, the most astonishing tapestry of giants, hunters, grazers, flyers, and swimmers Earth had yet known. A climax of diversity that felt as though it might last forever. But nothing in deep time lasts forever. And the same Earth that had lifted them into dominance was already preparing the stage for the silence that would come, for the fire that would descend from the heavens, for the shadow that would fall on this golden age. And so the world, at its brightest, unknowingly stood at the edge of its darkest hour.
The world had been moving toward this for millions of years, and now, in the heart of the Cretaceous, the age of the dinosaurs burned at its brightest flame, a golden zenith of diversity and scale where every corner of the planet seemed to pulse with life. On the broad plains of what would one day be North America, immense herds of hadrosaurs, the duck-billed grazers with their crests and calls, moved in sweeping migrations like rivers of muscle and scale, their numbers so vast that the ground itself trembled under their passage, their footprints pressing the earth into a living map of their dominion. Among them stalked the great predators of their time, most fearsome of all, the towering tyrannosaurs, apex hunters whose jaws carried the crushing force of bone-breaking thunder, whose gaze cut through dust and distance, marking the weak, the young, the straying. Their presence cast a shadow of primal dread across the land. And yet it was this balance of fear and survival that kept the plains alive in eternal tension. Elsewhere, armored giants stood as living fortresses, the ankylosaurs with their clubs of bone, the ceratopsians with their vast frills and horns like banners of war, guardians of their herds and defenders of their young, their clashes echoing like ancient drums across the meadows of the Mesozoic world. And in the skies, great pterosaurs ruled the winds, their wingspans stretching wider than any bird that would ever follow, the heavens alive with their gliding silhouettes, casting moving shadows across the wetlands and coasts below, where flocks of newly risen birds, smaller but swifter, feathered descendants of raptors, began testing their own mastery of the air. The seas, too, mirrored this grandeur, filled with the leviathans of the deep, mosasaurs, serpentine and vast, patrolling their kingdoms with predatory grace, plesiosaurs with their long necks like living serpents of the waves, ichthyosaurs still darting through the currents, swift as fish, but built like predators of steel, each ocean basin a theater of survival, where life could grow vast, but never complacent. Everywhere one looked, from deserts to forests, mountains to deltas, life had specialized, adapted, and thrived in forms more varied than ever before. From tiny mammals scurrying unseen in the shadows of leaf litter, waiting for a future that had not yet come, to the dinosaurs themselves, who stood as the supreme rulers of their age, seemingly eternal, seemingly invincible,
seemingly woven into the fabric of the earth itself. And yet, even here, at their height, the first faint whispers of change stirred in the background, subtle, invisible, but certain. Continents continued to drift further apart, climates shifted in patches, seas rose and receded, flowers spread slowly outward, reshaping the diets of herbivores, and with them the strategies of their hunters. For now, however, this was their world in full glory, the apex of their reign, the most astonishing tapestry of giants, hunters, grazers, flyers, and swimmers Earth had yet known. A climax of diversity that felt as though it might last forever. But nothing in deep time lasts forever. And the same earth that had lifted them into dominance was already preparing the stage for the silence that would come, for the fire that would descend from the heavens, for the shadow that would fall on this golden age. And so the world, at its brightest, unknowingly stood at the edge of its darkest hour.
The golden age lingers, but shadows gather at its edges. The great creatures of the Cretaceous still thunder across the plains, still graze in forests of cycads and magnolias, still hunt beneath skies alive with wings. Yet, in the silence between heartbeats, something begins to change. Volcanoes rumble more often now, their ash drifting into the heavens. Seas rise and fall with a strange unease. The climate whispers in new tones, sometimes too hot, sometimes too cold, a restlessness that unsettles even the mightiest of beasts. Life, always resilient, adapts as best it can, but the balance is delicate, and the scales begin to tip. Insects, once so perfectly tuned to the cycles of flowering plants, begin to falter. Coastal waters grow shallow, then vanish, stranding whole worlds of marine life. And deep in the earth, unseen by any creature, forces are gathering that will one day bring the story of these giants to a sudden, violent close. Yet here in this twilight before the end, the dinosaurs do not know. They still roam with majesty, still hunt, still rise on wings, still thunder with each step. But the quiet omens are there, written in stone, painted in the rhythm of the earth itself. And in this uneasy stillness we feel the weight of time pressing forward, toward an ending these creatures cannot see, but that the earth already senses. The shadow of extinction has begun to stretch across the golden age, and though it falls slowly, softly, like evening light across a plain, its reach is inevitable.
The shadows deepen. The golden age has begun to dim, yet the giants still move across the lands of the Cretaceous, unaware that their time is drawing to a close. The sauropods, immense and silent, graze in dwindling forests, their long necks reaching for leaves that grow sparser with each season. Predators, once numerous and confident, now move more cautiously, sensing changes in prey numbers and the subtle shifts of the land. The great ceratopsians march across plains that are slowly drying, their frilled heads catching the last warmth of a sun that seems lower, softer, less certain. Even the skies hold a different weight. Pterosaurs glide with fewer companions, their calls echoing over rivers and valleys that no longer teem with the same abundance. Insects hum less frequently among the blooms of flowers that have spread unevenly across continents, their rhythms subtly altered by shifting seasons and climates. The oceans, too, are restless. Shallow seas shrink and swell, currents change, and marine reptiles must range farther to find food, their hunting grounds fractured by the slow drift of land masses. These last giants are no weaker than their ancestors, yet something invisible presses upon them, a force they cannot see but must obey. It is the quiet pulling of deep time, the inevitability of change encoded in stone, in ash, in the shifting of continents and the slow rotation of the planet. Each footstep they take seems heavier now, each movement a testament to survival in a world that is quietly, irrevocably reshaping itself. And yet, even in this encroaching twilight, life persists in small, fragile ways. Tiny mammals scurry beneath leaf litter, unnoticed by the titans above. Bird-like dinosaurs cling to trees, experimenting with flight that will outlast the age of giants. Flowers continued to bloom in patches, coloring the landscape in quiet defiance of the coming silence. It is a world poised between grandeur and collapse, between memory and forgetting, where the earth itself seems to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable, yet still allowing beauty and majesty to linger for a little longer. These last giants move through this shifting world as if carrying the weight of all life that has come before them. They are monuments of endurance, of adaptation, of time's patient work. But beneath their massive forms, the ground trembles in ways that hint at the end, at the extinction that waits like a shadow at the edge of perception. And so we follow them, these final rulers of a fading age, witnessing the twilight of titans, the slow ebb of abundance, the gentle, inevitable march toward a silence that will soon blanket the lands and seas once ruled by giants. Yet, even as the sun lowers and shadows lengthen, the earth continues. Life's pulse still stirs beneath the soil, in the seas, in the skies. And from the echoes of these last giants, new stories will arise, carried forward by creatures small, quiet, and unseen. The age of the Titans is ending. And yet, in its ending, it whispers the promise of what is yet to come.
The world of giants holds its breath, moving through the last days of an age that has stretched for millions of years.
The forests are still vast, the rivers still shimmer, the oceans still pulse with life, and yet there is a sense of unease, a quiet tremor beneath the surface of everything, as if the earth itself is whispering a warning that only time can hear. Then, without announcement, the sky delivers a messenger unlike any before. A streak of light brighter than the sun slices through the atmosphere, a blazing arrow that seems to carry with it the weight of inevitability. Impact, and the ground shakes as though the heartbeat of the planet has quickened. Ash rises in clouds that blot out the sun, casting a twilight across lands and seas, where creatures of all sizes pause in instinctive alarm, sensing a change too vast to comprehend. The forests grow silent, or their cries are muffled beneath the falling dust. Rivers foam with stirred sediment, and oceans churn as if in anticipation. The last giants move instinctively, yet the rules they have known for millions of years no longer apply. Predators and prey alike scatter in a world suddenly unfamiliar, their rhythms of hunting, grazing, soaring, and swimming thrown into disarray. The sky darkens, not in a single moment, but in waves of heat and shadow. Volcanic eruptions, long smoldering, join the celestial fire, sending smoke and ash high into the stratosphere. The air grows thick, a blanket that cools some regions and scorches others. Rain falls in strange torrents, sometimes too acid, sometimes too sudden, washing through forests and deserts alike. Even the oceans, immense and patient, respond with turbulence, tides and currents shifting in ways that unravel the patterns of life beneath their surface. And yet, in the midst of this upheaval, life clings stubbornly. Dinosaurs, massive and small, continue to move, to forage, to seek safety. Marine reptiles dive deeper, hunting in shadowed depths. Bird-like dinosaurs cling to trees or attempt brief flights, their wings beating against smoky air. Even the smallest mammals scuttle beneath the chaos, surviving unnoticed, their quiet endurance a whisper of what will come next. Time itself seems to stretch, slowing in the heavy air, bending in the shadow of extinction. What had been a golden age, a zenith of scale and beauty, now feels fragile, ephemeral, as if the earth has paused to remind us that nothing lasts forever. Yet in this pause there is also a strange stillness, almost hypnotic, as if the planet allows us to witness its final act in slow motion. Every tremor, every flare of heat, every gasp of wind and water moving like a careful breath. And as ash drifts across continents, as fires burn forests into memory, as oceans and skies churn in quiet fury, the last giants face their limits of time. Some stumble, some perish, and some endure just enough to leave traces for the future. Bones pressed into rock, footprints frozen in mud,
whispers of life in the fossil record, speaking across millions of years to those who would listen. The world tilts, unrecognizable from the one that gave birth to these creatures. Yet, beneath the rubble, beneath the ashes and shadows, life waits, patient and persistent, ready to fill the spaces left behind, to carry forward the pulse of existence. The fire from the sky is both an ending and a beginning. It marks the close of the age of giants, yet quietly, almost imperceptibly, the seeds of the next world prepare to awaken. And from this silence, from this profound stillness, the story of life continues to take shapes unseen, waiting for the sun to rise once more over a world forever changed.
Silence stretches across the land, thick and heavy, blanketing forests, rivers, and plains in a gray haze. The sky, once blue and open, has turned into a canopy of ash, drifting slowly, covering every surface with a soft, choking blanket. It falls like snow in a world that has forgotten winter, settling on leaves, rocks, and water alike, muting color and sound, dimming the sun to a dull glow that barely warms the earth. The giants move cautiously, their senses alert, yet overwhelmed by a world now softened into shadow. The last of the towering sauropods graze through forests now brittle and gray, their long necks lifting through drifting ash flakes that cling to every branch. Predators move with uncertainty, their usual hunting grounds altered, scents muddied, tracks erased before they can follow them. Even the skies seemed muted. Pterosaurs glide silently, their wings cutting through a clouded world where thermals are unpredictable and light itself has lost its certainty. Beneath the ash, smaller creatures take refuge, hidden in hollows, beneath fallen logs, or within the shifting soil. Tiny mammals scurry, instinctively seeking safety in burrows that shield them from the slow rain of dust above. Insects, pollinators of once vivid blooms, struggle in the gloom, some trapped beneath layers of ash, others finding new ways to survive. Imperceptible, yet crucial threads in the fabric of life. The oceans, too, feel the weight of the sky's fall. Ash drifts onto the surface of seas and lakes, settling into the shallows, darkening waters, altering currents, and cooling the sunlit layers where plankton and smaller fish once thrived. Marine reptiles dive deeper, their hunting patterns interrupted, while fish scatter into unfamiliar zones, a subtle upheaval echoing across the food chains that have endured for millions of years. Time itself stretches differently now. Days seem dimmer, longer in shadow. Nights are almost indistinguishable from the clouded daytime. The pulse of life slows, though it does not stop. Every heartbeat, every movement, every breath carries a weight of survival that is quiet, steady, relentless. It is as if the earth itself holds its breath under this ash, waiting for a moment when the sun can pierce again,
when light will return, when life can reclaim its rhythm. And yet, even beneath the suffocating dust, resilience persists. Seeds, hidden beneath layers of fallen ash, await the warmth and water that will one day return. Small mammals continue to forage, unnoticed, imperceptible architects of the next age. Bird-like creatures cling to branches and crevices, their instincts quietly recalibrating to a world without certainty. Life is diminished, altered, yet patient, waiting for its moment to re-emerge from the gray. Ash falls slowly, covering every hill, every valley, every riverbed. It softens the landscape into a monochrome, a dreamlike reflection of the world that once thrived in color and motion. And in that quiet, in that drifting gray, the earth is both still and alive, holding stories of extinction, survival, and the slow, inevitable reshaping of ecosystems. The giants have fallen, the golden age is over, and yet beneath this ash, the threads of the future are quietly weaving themselves, unseen, unheralded, waiting for the world to breathe again. The fall of ash is not an end, but a pause, a moment of quiet transformation where life, small and patient, begins to imagine the shapes of tomorrow. Beneath the thick gray blanket of ash, the earth waits, patient and quiet, as if taking a long, deliberate breath before beginning again. In the stillness, tiny miracles unfold almost imperceptibly. Seeds buried by the fall of ash lie dormant in the soil, pressed into the earth like promises, waiting for warmth and rain to coax them toward life. Ferns, mosses, and the first shoots of flowering plants emerge cautiously, lifting toward whatever light filters through the lingering dust, their green a whisper against the gray. Small mammals and birds stir in the shadows, venturing further as the world softens, learning anew the rhythms of survival in a landscape subtly reshaped by loss. Insects follow, drawn to the tentative blooms, pollinating cautiously, ensuring that life's quiet exchanges continue even after so much has ended. The rivers and lakes, once clouded by ash, begin to clear, and fish return to shallow waters, uncertain yet persistent. Even the oceans feel the pull of recovery, plankton drifting upward once more, feeding the tiniest forms that will rebuild the complex web of marine life. Across the continents, life feels fragile, tentative, yet undeniable. Grasses and flowers creep along hills and valleys where giants once roamed, creating patterns of color and movement that are entirely new. The air hums with small wings, the quiet buzz of pollinators, the scurry of mammals, the cautious leaps of reptiles. It is a world still scarred, still muted by the memory of fire and ash, yet alive in ways that speak of resilience, of adaptation, of the slow, patient work of time. In this new world, scale is no longer measured by the immense forms of dinosaurs, but by the subtle persistence of life itself. Tiny creatures, unnoticed by the eye, begin to shape the future. Burrowing mammals aerate the soil, insects carry pollen from one fragile bloom to the next, and seeds find soil softened by ash to root and grow. Even in silence, life whispers its intentions, a careful murmur against the heavy quiet of a recovering earth. And yet, as small as these beginnings may seem, they carry with them the echoes of what came before. The giants of the Cretaceous are gone, but their bones enrich the soil, their footprints guide new streams, their presence lingers in memory and in stone. Life does not forget, but transforms, and from this transformation new ecosystems arise, quieter, perhaps, smaller, but no less persistent, no less full of wonder. Time stretches, patient and unhurried. Seasons pass, rains fall again. Ash settles deeper into the earth, nourishing, altering, reshaping the soil. And the first tendrils of forests begin to reclaim the plains, carrying with them the seeds of a world that will one day teem with diversity again. It is a world of patience, of subtlety, of quiet miracles, a world that reminds us that life does not end with a single catastrophe. It endures, it adapts, it waits, and in waiting it prepares the stage for forms of life we cannot yet imagine, creatures that will rise long after the giants have vanished, beings that will inherit the earth not through size or power, but through persistence and the careful weaving of small, quiet threads. From the ash comes the promise of green. From silence, the murmur of life returns, and the earth begins to breathe again, slowly, patiently, carrying the seeds of a new world toward the light.
From the scattered shoots of green, life slowly gathers strength, spreading across plains and valleys where ash once lay thick and silent. The first fragile ferns and flowering plants extend into gentle carpets, intertwining with grasses and mosses, softening the land with textures of quiet persistence. Rivers carve new paths through the earth, carrying nutrients that awaken seeds hidden beneath layers of dust, and tiny creatures follow, scattering life in their wake. The forests begin to climb, small at first, but patient, rooted in soils enriched by the rains of the age that passed. Saplings stretch skyward, seeking light through a hazy, recovering sun, while vines and shrubs begin to weave a gentle tapestry along the forest floor, and flowers tentatively bloom, coloring the understory with muted brilliance. Birds flit from branch to branch, newly evolved or surviving from small ancestors, their songs light threads weaving through the quiet rustle of leaves. Insects buzz, pollinating, nibbling, living unseen yet indispensable, carrying life forward in rhythms that the giants of the past could never have imagined. The land is alive with a softer energy now, a pulse that carries patience rather than power, persistence rather than size. Reptiles slither among roots, cautious hunters learning the ways of a quieter world.
Mammals, small and nimble, scurry through leaf litter and fallen logs, shaping soil and distributing seeds as they venture further from the shadowed burrows that sheltered them during the ashfall. Even the rivers teem once more, tiny fish and crustaceans reclaiming waters that had felt sterile and empty, creating webs of life that ripple outward, connecting forest, field, and stream. Time itself seems to slow as the forests reclaim the land. Each year adds a layer of canopy, each generation a subtle shift in the balance of predator and prey, growth and decay. The forests do not rush, yet they cover more ground than any single creature could traverse. Their spread a quiet, unstoppable reclamation. And the air itself feels changed, heavy with the scent of earth, of new leaves, and of the first fruits carried by wind and wing. These forests remember the age of giants, not through fear, but through transformation. Bones pressed into soil become minerals nourishing roots. Fallen leaves return as humus, and streams carry traces of what came before. The earth itself holds memory in layers of soil, sediment, and stone, as though quietly reminding all who will follow that even in loss there is continuity, that life is never fully erased. The landscape grows richer, denser, more complex with each passing season. Branches intertwine, leaves overlap, flowers bloom in hidden niches, and the quiet murmur of wind carries through newly formed canopies. Predators and prey, pollinators and grazers, swimmers and flyers all find new ways to coexist, creating ecosystems more intricate than those that existed before the end of the Cretaceous. And yet, even in this gentle flourishing, the pulse of deep time continues. The earth shifts imperceptibly beneath roots and rivers, shaping mountains, valleys, and plains. Volcanoes slumber and stir, seas rise and recede, climates shift, all subtle movements that will guide the next chapters of life yet to come. From the ashes of catastrophe, the forests now rise as living monuments to resilience. Every leaf, every root, every small creature is part of a slow, hypnotic symphony, carrying forward the legacy of life, patient, enduring, quietly insistent. The world is reclaimed not with thunder, but with patience, with persistence, with the soft insistence of green reaching always toward the light. And as the forests stretch their canopies higher and wider, we feel the promise of a world renewed. The giants are gone, the ash has settled, and life begins again, softly, patiently, inevitably. And yet, even in this rebirth, the earth keeps moving, whispering, turning, carrying us all toward the next unknown.
The forests stretch wider now, the rivers run clearer, and in the quiet spaces left by the vanished giants, life begins to explore new possibilities. Small mammals, once hidden and cautious, step into the light of a world that has softened and slowed, feeling their chance to move, to forage, to thrive.
Their forms are modest, their voices quiet, yet their presence carries a subtle insistence, a pulse of resilience that shapes the forest floor, the understory, and the edges of streams and rivers. They scurry among roots and fallen branches, clever and nimble, discovering niches that were once inaccessible, testing the limits of their small bodies against a world recovering its rhythm. Some climb trees with careful precision, learning balance and dexterity among the swaying branches. Others burrow deep into soil, aerating the earth, scattering seeds, leaving traces that will influence generations yet to come. They are not giants, but they are patient. They do not dominate with size, but with adaptability, curiosity, and persistence. Predators once overwhelmingly large are now replaced by smaller hunters, cunning, quiet, fast. Shrews, weasels, and early carnivorous mammals trace the movements of their prey, their instincts honed in this quieter, more intricate world. Life unfolds in layers, a delicate interplay of survival, curiosity, and slow mastery over space, light, and time. And the forests, now dense and complex, support this growing tapestry of mammals, birds, reptiles, and insects, each species finding its place in a world that has been reshaped from ash and silence. The earth seems to encourage exploration, its terrains still shifting, rivers carving new valleys, mountains settling slowly, climates alternating between warmth and coolness. Mammals move across these landscapes, discovering new food sources, new shelters, new ways to thrive. Their smallness allows them to endure, to adapt, to find refuge in the nooks and shadows that the giants never noticed, and in doing so, they quietly take center stage in a world that once belonged to scales and shadows beyond imagination. Life spreads outward in soft, persistent waves. Herds of grazing mammals roam in meadows, nibbling at tender shoots, while solitary hunters stalk silently along the edges of streams and forests. Even in the night, when shadows stretch long and the moonlight touches the forest floor, the mammals move with a rhythm that feels almost like music, soft, steady, and unbroken. Insects follow, feeding, pollinating, spreading life across a landscape that has become gentle yet full of intricate interactions. The oceans mirror these changes in miniature, as small marine mammals begin to explore niches left by the larger reptiles of the past. Rivers and lakes teem with tiny swimmers, cautious yet persistent, moving in ways that ripple outward to affect every other part of the ecosystem. Life is smaller, yes, but every movement carries weight, every survival a quiet revolution. Time continues to stretch, patient and unhurried, carrying the mammals forward, shaping evolution, guiding adaptation. Each generation learns from the landscapes, the predators, the plants, the rivers, and the shifting climates. They inherit a world still scarred by extinction, yet fertile with opportunity, ready to be explored, mapped, and transformed. And so, in this slow, quiet rhythm, mammals rise, patient architects of a new age,
carrying forward the pulse of life into forms that will one day dominate forests, plains, and rivers. The giants have fallen, the ash has settled, and the earth whispers its approval as these small, persistent creatures take their place, not in power or size, but in the quiet insistence of survival, exploration, and the gentle unfolding of time. From shadow and silence, life continues, and the Cenozoic begins, soft, patient, and full of the quiet drama of mammals taking center stage.
The earth breathes again, slowly, steadily, carrying the echoes of the past in every river, every forest, every mountain. The ash has settled, the giants have vanished, and in the spaces they left, life has quietly woven itself anew. Forests stretch across valleys and plains, rivers glide through softened banks, and meadows bloom with flowers, grasses, and the tender green of persistent hope. Mammals, once small and cautious, move through this rejuvenated world with confidence, shaping the soil, scattering seeds, carrying life forward with every careful step. Birds glide overhead, their wings slicing through skies that feel open and infinite again, their songs threading through canopies and across clearings, a gentle symphony of resilience. Insects buzz among blossoms, pollinating, feeding, sustaining, unnoticed yet indispensable, reminding us that life is composed of innumerable, delicate threads. Even the oceans, once churned by impact and ash, teem with quiet abundance. Fish and smaller marine mammals reclaim their territories. Plankton drifts upward, feeding the currents, and reefs begin to rebuild slowly, brick by brick, life by life. Every wave, every current, every movement of water reflects a patient recovery, a rhythm that mirrors the forests, the meadows, the mountains. Time itself seems to sigh, stretched across millions of years, teaching us that life's persistence is measured not in immediate triumph, but in patience, in endurance, in quiet unfolding. The earth is no longer the same as it was before the cataclysms. It is new, yet familiar, a palimpsest of memory, scar, and renewal. Mountains still bear the marks of shifting continents. Valleys trace the passage of rivers long vanished, and fossils whisper stories of creatures that once roamed in shadows and light. All of it woven together into a single, continuous tapestry of life, unbroken even by extinction, shaped by time, guided by the quiet persistence of survival. From the smallest mammal to the tallest tree, from the flutter of wings to the sweep of the ocean, every pulse of life carries forward a memory of what came before and the promise of what is yet to come. The earth, patient and eternal, cradles these lives, teaching us that even in loss there is renewal, and even in endings there is the soft beginning of something new. We watch as forests thicken, rivers meander, oceans calm, and life expands into every niche, every shadow, every sunlit corner. The giants may be gone, but the world is full of motion, of color, of sound,
a world reborn, not with thunder or spectacle, but with quiet, persistent grace. Every leaf, every paw, every fluttering wing, every ripple of water contributes to the slow, hypnotic heartbeat of a planet alive, aware, enduring. And in this final, gentle embrace of time, we understand that Earth's story is never truly over. It bends, it twists, it collapses, it rebuilds, and in its slow, quiet unfolding, it carries forward life in forms unseen, unimaginable, yet inevitable. From shadows, from ash, from silence, from loss, life emerges, adapts, flourishes, and whispers its promise across the ages. The earth is reborn, and in its rebirth, it offers a vision of persistence, patience, and quiet wonder. A world that reminds us that even when everything seems lost, life finds a way. And as the forests sway, the rivers glide, and the oceans pulse, we drift with them, carried on the long, soft rhythm of a planet that continues, always, gently, patiently, beautifully.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through the lost world of Pangea. If you enjoyed drifting through time and wonder with us, please give this video a like and subscribe so we can continue exploring Earth's mysteries together. And if you'd like, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. We'd love to hear from you as part of this quiet journey through deep time.